History remembers the suns, the cigar, the fireside chats, the defiance in the face of ruin. But Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt did not rise from nowhere. They were made, in nurseries and drawing rooms, beneath chandeliers and family portraits, by women who understood power long before the world allowed them to hold it openly. Sara Delano Roosevelt was silence, silver, discipline, inheritance. The matriarch who shaped Franklin as if shaping history itself. Jennie Jerome was fire, beauty, ambition, and nerve. The American mother who gave Churchill his bloodline, his hunger, and perhaps his first lesson in audacity. One ruled through restraint, the other through brilliance. And between them stood two sons who would one day face Hitler, war, collapse, and the terrible burden of command. Today, we begin not with the men history crowned, but with the women who made them possible. These are the lives of Sara Delano Roosevelt and Jennie Jerome Churchill. If you love deep, cinematic biographies of extraordinary women, there are more than 100 stories waiting for you here on Mythic Women, with many more coming this summer. So please subscribe and be part of it. Before there was President Franklin Roosevelt, before Eleanor marched and the world stood at the edge of ruin, there was Sara, born before the Civil War, into a world of porcelain rituals and brutal expectations. Sara Delano was raised not to lead but to endure. She crossed oceans as a child, buried siblings before adolescence, and learned early that silence was survival. Her father, a merchant who made his fortune in opium, ruled the house with absolute command. They were Astor 400, the elite of the Gilded Age, an American aristocracy bred to believe in bloodlines and their Mayflower past. At 26, she married a man 30 years her senior. She nearly died in childbirth, but what rose from the blood was purpose. She didn't just raise Franklin, she sculpted him, fed him, schooled him, dressed him, bankrolled him. Every lesson, every dollar, every ounce of power she gave to him. When he strayed from Eleanor, she cut him off. No more money, no more escape. You will stay, you will lead, you will rise. When polio shattered him, it was Sara who paid for his return, Sara who stood at his bedside, and Sara who told him, you will walk again. She clashed with Eleanor, ruled Springwood like a kingdom, funded war relief, hosted the King and Queen of England, and she never, not once, let go. And in 1924, when 12,000 delegates roared and Franklin crossed the stage on trembling legs, it was Sara who saw the halo. This isn't the story of the mother behind the man. It's the story of the woman who made him, a matriarch, a monarch, the quiet storm behind an American dynasty. Now let's begin the remarkable life of the woman who forged a president. Sara Delano was born into a world that believed in borders, of land, of lineage, of behavior. A world where silver gleamed before breakfast, where little girls spoke French before they spoke their minds, and where the highest virtue was composure. The year was 1854. The place was Algonac, a sprawling estate on the Hudson River, tucked between Albany's stone halls and Manhattan's rising towers. Behind rustling beech trees and a square brick facade, Sara entered the world as quietly as she would one day rule it. The Hudson Valley wasn't just a landscape, it was inheritance. America's river aristocracy built sanctuaries along its banks, marble stair by marble stair. Children played beneath portraits of Puritan ancestors, while governesses read from Pilgrim's Progress. Everything had its place, especially the Delanos. They didn't display wealth, they embodied it. Sara's father, Warren, had returned from China with a fortune measured in silks, porcelain, and silence. He had made his name in opium, though such things were rarely spoken aloud. But it wasn't his money that defined him. It was his authority. Sara's childhood was not merely privileged. It was choreographed. Each morning began with a bell, each hour allotted to a lesson, a meal, a walk, the scent of beeswax, the rustle of petticoats, the click of mother-of-pearl scissors. This was her world. She would later call it tranquil. What she meant was controlled. At age 4, Sara gashed her head on a cabinet and ran to her father, bleeding. He said nothing. He cleaned the wound and stitched it shut himself. Be brave, he told her. She didn't cry. That moment became her myth. Pain endured in silence, love expressed through control. Her mother, Catherine, was gentler, musical, composed. But Sara admired her father more than she imitated her mother. Her loyalty, even then, was to iron, not lace. With his competence, his preferred word for fortune, Warren had purchased Algonac, 40 rooms, wide corridors hung with family portraits, rosewood furniture, a Buddhist bell in the garden. The house was not ostentatious, it was ordained. Sara grew up steeped in ritual. The world beyond stirred, war loomed, fortunes shifted. But inside Algonac, the clock never skipped a beat. That rhythm became her law. And in time, she would pass it on, not as a suggestion, but as scripture, to her only son. The children never heard their parents quarrel. Warren ruled with a glance. While not all Democrats are horse thieves, he'd proclaim at breakfast, all horse thieves are Democrats. Sara drank it in with her morning chocolate. Catherine kept the machinery running with invisibility. She never contradicted Warren. Her grace lay in orbiting power, not contesting it. Sara would adopt this posture herself, then find it hard to escape. But when Sara was 7, the illusion cracked. In 1857, the American economy collapsed. Warren, like many, lost everything. He sold the Manhattan townhouse. Algonac fell quiet. Then, with the same resolve he'd once used threading a needle through his daughter's scalp, Warren returned to China to restore his fortune. He left behind a pregnant wife, 7 children, and an estate still manicured but hollow with absence. Catherine remained. She managed the household like bone china, beautiful, brittle, and breakable. A cousin taught lessons, an aunt enforced posture. The older girls sewed for Union soldiers. Warren wrote from abroad. Sara soaked the stamps off his letters. "There was no one like my father," she said, decades later with the certainty of someone who had stopped comparing. Then in 1862, Warren summoned the family to Hong Kong. Catherine, who had once buried a child in the heat of Canton, gathered 7 living children and boarded a ship. No husband, no help, no complaint. Her diary spoke only of weather and waves. "We must look forward to the happy meeting with our husband and father in Hong Kong." The voyage took 6 months, past the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea. The Delanos were the only paying passengers. There were chilblains, vomiting, heat like a curtain, but structure prevailed. Latin was recited to the rhythm of the sea. On calm days, they dined on oyster soup and pork. Sara remembered sea shanties, constellations, flag signaling. Discomfort for her was not trauma. It was routine. In later years, Franklin would keep a model of that very ship on his Oval Office desk. In Hong Kong, they moved into Rose Hill, a walled estate where American holidays were observed, hymns were sung, pony carts decorated. China existed beyond the gates. But inside, America held. Then illness struck. Her brother Philippe caught diphtheria. Sara, just 10, was sent home, along with her older brother and younger sibling. Her sister Annie, 15, shepherded them across the world. Their parents stayed behind. It would be 2 years before they saw them again. In photographs from this time, Sara stares into the lens. Square jaw, composed mouth, eyes that reveal nothing. A serious girl, the daughter of command. Warren returned to America wealthy once more, and unrepentant. The opium trade had built his empire, and he never denied it. "I do not pretend to justify the opium trade morally," he wrote, "but as a merchant, I insist it was fair, honorable, and legitimate, no different from importing wine or spirits." Sara never questioned the silk or porcelain that filled their home. To her, the Delanos were the best of America. Mayflower stock, civic leaders, self-made men who still read Latin. Her father was a monument, and the monument never cracked. Rather than settle in a fractured post-war republic, Warren took the family to Paris, where order wore perfume and wealth spoke French. Their apartment near the Avenue de l'Impératrice overlooked the 1867 Exposition. Paris was gay with flags and bunting, Sara recalled. She and her brother watched sovereigns parade past, but it was Empress Eugenie, gliding through the crowd, who captured her heart. But Paris, like childhood, wasn't built to last. Warren tired of the city's continental riffraff. They moved to Dresden, where the walls echoed coldly and the customs were stiff. Sara, now fluent in French, turned to German, music, and history. Then came the telegram. Her eldest sister, Louise, was dead. Sara packed her trunks in silence. Her grief, like her gloves, was folded into the corners. She boarded the Westphalia, the last ship to leave Germany before war engulfed Europe. Once again, the Delanos escaped history's bloodshed. Sara returned to Algonac, taller, paler, composed. Life resumed. skating parties, church on Sundays, lamplight readings, and rainy afternoons in the schoolroom. Grief became routine. The next chapter should have been predictable. Debutante balls, dinners, the soft search for a husband. But Sara waited. She had no need to marry for money. The Delanos were already among the 400, invited to Mrs. Astor's ballroom as a matter of course. She was intelligent, unflappable, discerning. She joined her mother on charity rounds, but remained cloistered. Suitors came. Warren held the gate. Who are his people? He'd ask. That mattered more than roses or charm. At 21, one name slipped through. Stanford White, magnetic and promising. He sent flowers. Warren intercepted both the bouquet and the man. I do not care for that one, he said, and Sara obeyed. She danced at the patriarch balls. She was admired, statuesque, elegant, but she preferred books to flirtation. By 26, she had endured 7 seasons. Her sisters were married. Her friends had children. Still, she waited, not with restlessness, but with serene resolve. She managed the household, walked with her father after supper, became his confidant. She was the daughter he would not give away. Then, in April 1880, something shifted. At a small dinner at the Roosevelt home, she sat beside a man who spoke only to her. James Roosevelt, widowed and silver-haired, was 26 years her senior. A lawyer, landowner, and family friend was considered one of them. Quietly wealthy, impeccably mannered. He paid visits to Algonac. She visited Springwood. Walks, tea, and gentle conversation. Within a week, it was clear they had chosen each other. Warren was stunned. James was a Democrat, an Episcopalian. But Sara said simply, I want this. And Warren yielded. 10 weeks later, they were engaged. Sara would later say, James was the first person who made me realize a Democrat can be a gentleman. The wedding was elegant but restrained. Her beloved aunt had died just weeks before. Still, it was a display of quiet grandeur. Guests traveled upriver by steamer and carriage, through villages hung with bunting. Observers noted the contrast. Sara, radiant in white brocade, towered over her groom, graying, stooped, already softened by the years. Such a brilliant girl, someone whispered, to marry a man so much her senior. But Sara had made her choice. She did not flinch. After the ceremony, she stepped from her father's carriage into her husband's. Halfway to Hyde Park, she changed coaches, quietly, symbolically crossing the threshold. At Springwood, she wrote in her journal, Marriage of James Roosevelt and Sara Delano, October 7, 1880. Outwardly, it was a seamless passage, from daughter to wife, one estate to another. But Sara brought greater wealth. There were no dowries. This was not elevation. It was continuity. She believed in hierarchy, daughter, wife, mother. But beneath that title was the same composed authority, the girl who never cried when the needle pierced her scalp. At first, she adapted. She traded Unitarian hymns for the solemnity of St. James Episcopal. She played bezique, kept the late wife's carpets, even kept the Scottish housekeeper. Her only change, the drawing room curtains replaced with Chinese damask from her father. Quiet, symbolic. The new mistress of Springwood had arrived. The Roosevelt web soon enclosed her. Across the lawn lived James's son Rosie, his wife Helen, and their young son Tatty. Nearby stood the grand villa of James's mother, still the reigning matriarch in her lace cap. A mile away, Uncle John Roosevelt presided over another house full of children and noise. Yet, when James traveled to Manhattan, Sara summoned the carriage and returned to Algonac. The deep Chesterfields and cabinets glittering with jade still whispered of home. Springwood was an extension, not a severance. The crown had passed, but the altar remained. Politics rarely touched their lives. James, a staunch Democrat, disdained the glad handing of office seekers and passed that wariness to Sara. 5 days after the 1880 election, the newlyweds sailed to Europe. Their 10-month honeymoon unfolded like a procession of inheritance. Italy, Switzerland, Holland, Spain. They traveled in private carriages, stayed in grand hotels, shopped for Renaissance tapestries, and avoided beggars with polite discretion. Sara's diary was a ledger of sights, not feelings. Garden walks in Florence, concerts, consuls, cathedrals. In Paris, Warren rented an entire floor of the Hôtel du Rhin for a month of opera. In London, they dined with Madame Goldschmidt, once the Swedish nightingale, Jennie Lind, now stout and cheerful in black taffeta. Sara found bullfights cruel and wrote only, James too devoted to me. Her entries revealed little, but in York that August she nearly fainted during service. She was 4 months pregnant. It was was time to return. Aboard the Germanic, she wrote, "Such happy days." Back at Springwood, winter descended. Gas lamps flickered, and in January, 16 months after their wedding, Sara went into labor. The child would not come. Chloroform was administered. The baby, large, blue, silent, slid into the world. Then came a cry. The child lived. Sara nearly did not. James recorded, "At 8:45, my Sally had a splendid large baby boy. He weighs 10 pounds without clothes." A son had been born, a legacy renewed, but the triumph was shadowed. Sara's brother Philippe had just died. 12 days later, her young nephew succumbed to typhoid. Her recovery was slow. She remained in bed for weeks. The doctor warned against future pregnancies. Sara did not mourn the verdict. She redirected everything, every ounce of herself, toward the child she had. Where society women handed infants to nursemaids, Sara nursed Franklin herself. She dressed him, rocked him, shielded him. From the moment he drew breath, Franklin was the sun around which her days revolved, and would remain as long as she lived. Even his name was hard-won. Roosevelt tradition dictated Isaac. James insisted. But Sara, usually deferential, stood firm. She proposed Warren. In the end, she chose a gentler name, Franklin, for her favorite uncle. Her father approved. "A beautiful little fellow," he wrote, "well and strong, with a good-shaped head of the Delano type." In March, they christened the child Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The family lunched afterward, unaware how far that name would travel. Sara resumed her quiet command at Hyde Park, driving her dog cart through the countryside, delivering food, bolts of flannel, flowers for the sick. Wherever she went, Franklin followed, bundled in starched skirts, blonde curls gleaming. His first smile, tooth, and step were noted in her diary. She dressed him in kilts, then London sailor suits. When his curls were cut at 5, she saved them in a silk-lined box, her reliquary of devotion. At Springwood, he was treated like a little prince. At Algonac, he was adored. Once, when asked what made him so charming, the 4-year-old replied, "Oh yes, I'm chock full of tacks." It became a family joke and a prophecy. Up to the age of 7, Franklin once said, Hyde Park was the center of the world, and from his first breath, he had been the center of Sara's. When Franklin was 3, the family resumed travel. By 4, he had visited Europe's capitals, climbed the Eiffel Tower, and admired golden palaces from a velvet-lined carriage. But in 1885, returning on the Germanic, a violent storm struck. Waves smashed the hull. Water poured under doors. The captain was unconscious. Lifeboats were lost. James feared the ship might sink. Sara did not panic. "Poor little boy," she whispered. "If he must go down, he will go down warm." She wrapped Franklin in her fur coat and waited. James demanded the ship turn back. It did. The Germanic limped into Liverpool. Franklin would never forget how his parents met fear, with stillness. It would serve him well through the fires that were to come. In 1886, the family visited Washington. James declined a diplomatic post, preferring Hyde Park. While he lobbied for business, Sara thrived, floating through dinners and teas, admired for her poise. At the White House, President Cleveland tousled Franklin's curls. "My little man," he said, "I'm making a strange wish, that you may never be president." Sara, who shared her husband's distaste for politics, wrote it in her diary. Years later, asked if she foresaw her son's rise, she replied, "Never, oh never. My highest ideal was that he grow up straight and honorable, just and kind, like his father." 2 themes ran through Sara's diaries like a watermark: the closeness of family and a constant watchfulness over the health of her husband and son. Her worst fear came to life in 1889. At 7, Franklin fell gravely ill aboard the Adriatic, en route to England. Diagnosed with typhoid fever, he was carried to the captain's quarters. Sara sat beside him, sleepless, upright, unmoved, watching, waiting. When they docked in Liverpool, a private tender met the ship. A nurse was dispatched. Franklin was carried to recover in a doctor's home. Sara refused to leave until she was certain, absolutely certain, that her child would live. Only then did she return to her routines. Frequent trips to Manhattan let her slip back into the theater and music scenes. Her diary noting performances by Nellie Melba, Paderewski, Sarah Bernhardt, Sir Henry Irving. Franklin, meanwhile, delighted in the Museum of Natural History and carriage rides through Central Park. In the evenings, Sara appeared in black satin and diamonds, elegant, understated, the quiet perfection of old money. Summers belonged to Campobello. On that wild island off the Maine coast, the Roosevelt cottage overlooked the Bay of Fundy. Sara organized tea parties and sailing outings. Under her vigilant eye, Franklin became a skilled young sailor, mastering the treacherous tides with confidence that would later serve him in deeper, more political waters. In public, she and James appeared the picture of marital harmony. But beneath the polish, something shifted. Theirs had become a marriage marked by temperament and time. Sara, still young and socially alive, longed for opera houses and conversation. James, aging and cerebral, preferred a book, a cigar, and quiet. His rigidity sometimes clashed with Sara's loyalties. They never shared a bedroom. It was not unusual for their class. But after childbirth, intimacy ebbed into quiet abstention, an agreement never spoken, never broken. She was content to define herself as wife and mother. In her diary, she recorded Franklin's development with precision. She praised his Delano determination never to make a fuss. One winter in Paris, James hired a governess. Sara, fiercely protective of her bond with Franklin, found the young woman overbearing. Franklin never complained. Only when asked directly did he murmur, "I think she's perfectly awful." And why hadn't he said so? Because after all the trouble and expense, it seemed wrong to grumble. His stoicism, like his charm, had been learned at his mother's knee. In 1890, James Roosevelt suffered a heart attack, which diminished both his stamina and his presence. Sara assumed control over finances, travel, and Franklin's future. A London doctor prescribed the mineral springs of Bad Nauheim for James, and for several summers the family took the cure. To occupy her energetic son in the quiet spa town, Sara enrolled him in a local school. He wrote home in delight, "Papa got me a great big boat. I sail it every day. I have a splendid bow and arrow. I go to school with a lot of little Mickeys and study German history and arithmetic." His ability to adapt, even among strangers, mirrored Sara's own resilience. But when the waters offered little reprieve, Sara sought escape in the Black Forest. One summer, she and 9-year-old Franklin climbed the Blauen, an alpine peak over 3,800 feet high, and spent the night in a mountain lodge. At dawn, watching the sun catch on distant peaks, she savored what James no longer could: vitality. As their stays in Bad Nauheim grew longer, they began stopping in London first. Sara visited her sister Cassie, her stepson Rosie, her circle of American friends. Dora and Annie offered laughter and a link to their golden girlhood at Algonac. She lunched, shopped on Regent Street, treated Franklin to ice cream at Fuller's, and she passed down what mattered most. By 10, Franklin spoke French and German, knew naval history, bird watching, and the capitals of Europe. His stamp collection grew. His worldview expanded. It was hard for people to believe he had never been to school, Sara later wrote. They marveled at his grasp of subjects that did not ordinarily interest children so young. And yet, even she understood that the cocoon must one day open. By the time Franklin neared adolescence, she conceded, reluctantly, that it was time for him to meet other boys. To learn the social choreography she could not teach, to step just slightly beyond the borders of Hyde Park. The choice had been made years earlier, when Franklin was still an infant. Sara and James had enrolled him in a school that did not yet exist. Groton, the new academy in the Massachusetts hills, founded by Reverend Endicott Peabody. Modeled after the British public school ideal, Groton aimed to mold the sons of American wealth into Christian gentlemen. Rigid timetables, austere dormitories, and the resounding motto, "To serve is to rule." Reverend Peabody wanted Franklin to begin at 12. But Sara could not bear it. Not yet. The child was still hers. 3 years later, she relented. After a return from Europe in 1896, Sara steeled herself. "We dusted his birds," she wrote. "He had a swim in the river. I looked on, with a heavy heart." On September 15th, they boarded the private railroad car north. At Groton, she helped him unpack. She adjusted his socks, noted his white-faced resolve, and before the farewell, he visited the train one last time. That night, she confided, "It is hard to leave my darling boy." Franklin's first letters home were cheerful and polite. "I am getting on finely both mentally and physically. We study French tonight." Sara preserved them all. Some she corrected in the margins, and when a letter failed to arrive on time, she telegraphed Reverend Peabody. Was he sleeping? Was he cold? Had he been hurt? In October, they visited. Franklin was well and handsome, full of punctuality, Latin prizes, clean shoes. Sara beamed. Everything was in order. But all was not well. Franklin, raised among adults, had no armor for the rough rituals of boyhood. His polished manners, faintly English accent, and delicacy in sport all marked him as different. He found it difficult at first, a classmate would recall, with these handicaps, to adjust to boarding school life. Sara never imagined it. She assumed society would open to Franklin as it had to her, smoothly, gracefully. She never guessed her radiant boy would suffer to belong. But he endured, and he learned something his mother had never needed. Pain could be hidden beneath charm. It was a lesson that would carry him farther than Groton's chapel. Back at Springwood, James continued his slow, deliberate decline. Even the September train to see Franklin off had left him bedridden for days. Sara, frightened, wrote, "It has almost made me ill." There was no longer any doubt. James required constant care. In April 1897, Sara and James set sail for Europe, leaving Franklin behind for the first time. "Nothing but James's health would induce me to cross the ocean without Franklin," she wrote. From school, Franklin wrote wistfully, "I am thinking of you as sitting in your chairs on deck, enjoying this lovely weather." In Germany, the rituals resumed. Tea at Bad Nauheim, slow walks, Episcopal services. But the rhythms of health, once believed eternal, were now breaking down. The next year, another telegram came. Franklin had scarlet fever. "James is so upset," Sara wrote, "that I dare not show how I feel." When a second cable followed, Franklin developed inflamed kidneys, Sara broke. Within 24 hours, she booked passage and crossed the Atlantic, enduring 8 days at sea with no word of her child's condition. Sara faced an impossible choice: remain isolated with her son or return to Hyde Park to tend her husband. She chose a third path. On the school grounds, she found a ladder. Lifting her skirts, she climbed to the second-story window of the infirmary and tapped softly on the glass. Each time, Franklin looked up to see her there, composed, smiling through the wind. A boy behind a window, a mother refusing to be kept out. But the world around her was changing. In 1898, her father Warren passed. Sara stood vigil at his bedside holding his hand. The man who had taught her strength, stoicism, passing from her world. Sara composed herself and carried on as Warren had taught her. That autumn, Franklin, now taller than his mother, entered Harvard. Sara's diary entries before Franklin's departure for college were unusually tender. On her 46th birthday, she wrote, "My dear James surprised me with a cake and candles and sapphire sleeve links." 3 days later, Franklin took her on a long, quiet canoe ride down the Hudson. The next morning, he left for Boston. Our dear Franklin left us for college. A great step. His first weeks at Harvard were unsettled by scandal. His cousin, Tatty Roosevelt, son of Rosie, had dropped out of Harvard and vanished into the shadows of the Tenderloin district. After his mother's death, Tatty had grown erratic. Now, he had eloped with a Hungarian-born dance hall girl, Sadie Messenger. Short and plump, the newspapers smirked, but accounted a beauty of her type. The press erupted. Boy millionaire weds, Astor Sion's bride won in dance hall, crowed the headlines. Just as Uncle Theodore campaigned for the vice presidency, the disgrace hit James Roosevelt hard. Sara wrote bitterly to Franklin, "I am sorry Tatty has Papa's name if he is not going to grace it." 2 nights later, James suffered a second heart attack. "The dreadful business about Tatty was the last straw," she confided in her diary. Franklin rushed home, and in a final attempt to save him, Sara moved James to Manhattan to be near his doctor. Franklin sat beside him daily. In the early hours of December 8, 1900, surrounded by his wife and 2 sons, James Roosevelt died. "All is over," Sara wrote in her diary. Back at Springwood, alone for the first time in decades, Sara filled her diary with sorrow. "The days drag on, we have to bear them." Christmas passed in near silence. As Franklin prepared to return to Harvard, she wrote simply, "I dread his leaving." But grief did not consume her. She took up James's routines, riding Bobby, the Kentucky saddle horse she had gifted him for his 71st birthday, overseeing the filling of the ice houses, tending to the ancient rhythms of Springwood. She reassured Franklin, "You need not worry about me. I am all right." She resumed calling on the Vanderbilts. She spent time with her sisters and began traveling annually to London and Paris, now as a woman entirely her own. Sara's refusal to crumble left a deep imprint on Franklin, whose own stoicism in the face of polio would later echo hers. James's will left her everything: Springwood, Campobello, the family's investments. Franklin, still legally a minor, received a generous trust, but it was clear the future belonged to her command. There were suitors. Sara was wealthy, exquisitely dressed, fluent in 3 languages, and unchallenged in social rank. But no one breached the fortress of her self-possession. Her loyalty now belonged to one person, Franklin, and as she had done her whole life, she would pour her heart and soul into her son. There would be no chaos, only command. Regal in black silk, Sara issued instructions to servants, presided over Springwood, organized charities, and kept meticulous notes on Franklin's development. She had no hunger for the world's stage, but within her private empire, she ruled without rival. She wanted Franklin to flourish, but never drift too far. She hoped he'd marry someone who would preserve her place at the center of his life, not replace it. He welcomed her attention, until of course he didn't. Remember, she chided, it takes only 10 or 15 minutes to write a nice letter to your ever-loving mother. Franklin obliged. Letters came from Harvard, updates on rowing crew, debates, club elections, the crimson. The stream of achievement soothed her. His father and I always expected a great deal of Franklin, she said. We were pleased, but not surprised when he delivered. What she never knew, he'd been rejected from the Porcelain Club, his father's old fraternity. He didn't tell her. Even a small disappointment might summon her to Cambridge. Her care was protection, disguised as control. And Franklin was learning the skill that would define his adulthood, managing Sara. To her, he was still a child, especially when money was involved. She didn't yet see how carefully he had begun to curate her version of his life. In the summer of 1901, they cruised to Norway, just mother and son with family friends. But when they docked in America, a telegram awaited. President McKinley had been assassinated. Franklin's distant cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, was now president of the United States. Shock gave way, quickly in Sara's circle, to a ripple of pride, a Roosevelt in the White House. Family legacy made visible. But time was pressing forward, and Sara had begun to feel it. She ruled Springwood like a dowager duchess, tending gardens, greenhouses, the cow barn. But winter brought silence. She began taking breakfast in bed. Servants began to slip. A cook dismissed for being too cross. A caretaker called disgusting. A coachman, Sims, who had started drinking again. I tried to get Sims to sign the pledge, she wrote, but he refuses. By spring of 1902, she needed change. She rented a Boston apartment with her sister Dora, close enough to the university to be on hand, far enough not to interfere, she wrote. There, she hosted luncheons with old acquaintances from Hyde Park and Campobello. She made new friends too, Isabella Stewart Gardner and Julia Ward Howe, whom she described as a dear old thing, always dressed in soft white wool like a little nightgown. Weekends belonged to Franklin. She hosted teas for his Harvard friends and their sisters. She encouraged his passion for naval history, helping build what would become his vast collection, 7,000 books, 600 maritime prints. Boston gave Sara what she craved more than quiet: purpose. For the first time since James's death, she was at the center of things again. But Franklin had learned to move through her world without fully belonging to it. He developed quiet strategies. He claimed late hours at the Crimson. Sometimes he simply didn't come home. His romantic life was hidden. His letters mentioned flirtations, never names. Sara had tried to invite girls to Springwood. He called them pills, ice carts, elephantine. He knew even the suggestion of affection might be read as betrayal. He seems to have known, wrote Jeffrey C. Ward, that any sign of romantic interest would be seen by Sara as betrayal of their exclusive devotion. In 1903, Franklin asked to travel to Europe with a classmate, his first trip abroad without her. It was only 4 weeks, but to Sara, it was rebellion. She was stunned. "Of course, dearest Franklin," she replied. "I shall miss you, but I have no intention of tying you to my apron strings." She said the words, but she wept on the dock. "I meant to be very brave," she wrote. Back at Harvard, he began his final year. Sara turned to his future. She imagined law, Columbia, not Harvard, New York, home. "I merely wish you would think seriously of it and realize how much it will be for you and for me to be near your own home, not too far out of reach." Then came a moment of fate. It was fall, 1902. Sara sat in the parlor car of a northbound train, veiled in black lace. Franklin had gone to stretch his legs. Half an hour passed. When he returned, a young woman followed, tall, composed, with a steady smile, dark gloves, and an elegant coat. It was Eleanor Roosevelt, niece of the president. Franklin had spotted her in another carriage, reading quietly. They hadn't seen each other in years. Conversation came easily. Now, Eleanor greeted Cousin Sally with warmth and deference. Sara nodded politely. She thought little of it. She didn't know what would follow. The weekends, the house parties, the quiet walks at Springwood. She didn't know that Franklin had begun filling Eleanor's dance card, or that Eleanor, twice a week, rode the rattling 2nd Avenue L down to the Lower East Side to teach immigrant girls how to dance. One afternoon, Franklin met her after class. A child had collapsed. Together, they carried her up 3 flights of tenement stairs, the stench and heat closing in around them. "I simply couldn't believe human beings lived that way," he kept saying. Sara never heard the story, but Franklin had seen something rare in Eleanor: conviction. What Eleanor carried from Allenswood was not polish, it was purpose. "E is an angel," he wrote in his journal. When he invited Eleanor to Springwood, Sara assumed it was courtesy, so when he announced their engagement that Thanksgiving, it struck like lightning. Sara showed nothing publicly, but inwardly she reeled that her instinct had missed it, that her perfect, polished son had made a decision without her, that someone had taken her place. Sara, precise, self-possessed, immaculately composed, would never fully understand her future daughter-in-law. She found her frail, unformed, a pupil, not a partner. Yes, she knew Eleanor's childhood had been difficult. But how, Sara wondered, could a Roosevelt, the niece of a president, fail to overcome such things? In Sara's world, legacy was armor, name was compass. What excuse remained for fragility? Eleanor's parents had once dazzled society. Anna Hall, a Hudson Valley beauty known for her languid grace, and Elliot Roosevelt, athletic, magnetic, and ruinously unreliable. When Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884, her arrival was dutifully noted in the society columns. Her uncle Teddy stood as her godfather, but beneath the golden surface, the family was already unraveling. Elliot, a gifted playboy, spiraled into addiction. Anna, emotionally cool, failed to bond with her solemn, awkward child. On a visit to Hyde Park, when 2-year-old Eleanor hesitated in a doorway, Anna laughed. "Come in, Granny," she called. "She's such a funny child, so old-fashioned." Eleanor remembered the moment all her life. Her father, though adored, became a ghost in slow motion. He left for Europe, promising recovery. When he returned briefly, he took her for a walk, then vanished into the Knickerbocker Club, leaving her waiting alone for 6 hours. In 1892, Anna died of diphtheria. Soon after, Eleanor's little brother died. Then Elliot, drunk and despairing, drove a carriage into a lamppost. He was 34, Eleanor was 10. "From that time on," she wrote, "I lived with him more closely than when he was alive." She and her surviving brother, Hall, were sent to Oak Terrace, a crumbling mansion near Tivoli, to live with their grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, a woman who offered, in cousin Corinne Alsop's words, little more than leftover love. By adolescence, Eleanor was painfully shy and relentlessly self-critical. "I was always afraid," she recalled, "of the dark, of displeasing people, of failure." Her aunt Edith was blunt. She is very plain. Her teeth and mouth seem to have no future, but the ugly duckling may yet become a swan. The transformation began at 15. She was sent to Allenswood, a London school run by Marie Souvestre, an intellectual and moral force. Under Souvestre, Eleanor found something rare: belief. She returned to New York after 3 years, more composed, but summoned back to a house riddled with secrets. Her uncle fired pistols from his window. Her brother drank. The money was nearly gone. If you want a full story on the fascinating and tragic life of Eleanor Roosevelt, let me know in the comments. Sara responded to the engagement in the only way she knew how: strategically. She reminded Franklin she held the purse strings and demanded a 1-year delay. She arranged a lunch with Eleanor in New York. "Franklin will spend time with me in Boston," she said. "Perhaps you'll join us, once or twice." The conversation was cordial, but the air between them was tight with unspoken truths. That night, Eleanor wrote Franklin, "Boy, darling, I have a hard letter to write. It's hard for her to realize anyone could want or need you more than she does. I mustn't complain, must I?" Franklin replied to Sara, "I know my mind." Nothing can change what we are to each other, dear mummy. Now you have 2 children to love. Sara had placed them both on the defensive, but she had also bought herself a year. Behind the smiles, she watched. Waited. She reached out to Joseph Choate, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, in search of a diplomatic post, any opportunity to delay the marriage. Choate replied, no positions were available, so she proposed a 6-week cruise for herself, Franklin, and his friend Lathrop Brown. It would mean missed classes, compromised grades, but she believed the voyage would restore their bond. Franklin agreed. The Princess and Victoria Louise carried them through the Danish West Indies, Puerto Rico, Barbados, Venezuela, Jamaica. Franklin played cards. Sara basked in the attention of 2 young men. For a moment, it felt like before. He was her boy. She was the center of the orbit. Back in Washington, she arranged a meeting with Eleanor at Aunt Bamie's home. She even sat beside her at a White House dinner. The president was very delightful, she wrote. I wonder how small men can criticize and belittle him. In New York, she dined and shopped with Eleanor. The girl tried. I know 3 will never be the same as 2, Eleanor wrote, but someday I hope she will love me, or at least be reconciled. Sara wasn't ready. She smiled, but behind the smile, she measured everything. Meanwhile, Franklin enrolled at Columbia Law School. President Roosevelt, his booming theatrical uncle, had gone there. Eager to please, Franklin mimicked his voice, his gestures, even adopted similar spectacles. Sara approved. Columbia was close. She rented him a brownstone at 200 Madison Avenue, complete with servants, and a Lesbie brought down from Hyde Park. But once he settled in, the familiar ache returned. I am feeling pretty blue, she wrote. The journey is over. I feel as if the time may never come again when I shall take a trip with my dear boy. Still, she promised to accept Eleanor. I will love her and adopt her fully when the right time comes. I rejoice in your happiness and shall not put any stones or straws in the way. What she didn't say was that the right time would be hers to choose, not Franklin's. True to his word, Franklin kept the engagement secret for a year. During that time, Sara moved with seamless purpose into the role of planner, guide, and mother-in-law-to-be. With Eleanor's mother long gone, Sara stepped easily into the space. She chose fabrics, she handled lists, she summoned her own childhood of propriety and spectacle and spun it into quiet choreography. It gave her structure, it gave her purpose, and once again, it gave her control. In December 1904, the New York Times announced the engagement. Sara stood poised as Eleanor crossed her threshold, welcomed in name but not in heart. She smiled for guests, nodded in approval, but behind the veil of civility, the balance had shifted. The engagement drew headlines, though attention leaned toward the president's niece. Well-wishers wrote from Groton, from Washington, from the White House. Teddy Roosevelt himself sent a glowing note. I am as fond of Eleanor as if she were my own daughter. Still, doubts lingered. Cousin Corinne Alsop would later reflect, she had lived through so much unhappiness, and then to marry a man with a mother like Cousin Sally, a more determined and possessive woman than I have ever known. In the short term, though, Eleanor was grateful. Sara's world of rituals and structure offered something Eleanor had never known, a choreography she could follow, a shelter. On the eve of the wedding, March 16, 1905, Sara wrote, This is Franklin's last night at home as a boy. Eleanor wore a stiff satin gown adorned with rose point Brussels lace, worn by her mother and grandmother. Sara gifted her a pearl and diamond choker in the style of Queen Alexandra. 200 guests gathered, Roosevelts, Delanos, Halls, Vanderbilts. Sara, in white silk and black lace, cut her usual striking figure. At 3:30 p.m., the president arrived to walk the bride down the aisle. Brass from the St. Patrick's Day parade thundered through the windows. Louder still was Teddy's parting line. Well, Franklin, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family. Moments later, guests flooded into the library to hear the president speak. He held court for over an hour. Alice Roosevelt later quipped, Father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Sara was content. Everyone says it was the most perfect wedding, so simple, yet so elegant and refined, she wrote to Franklin. I was very proud of both my dear children. While the newlyweds spent a quiet week at Hyde Park, Sara returned to Manhattan, preparing the next act like a stage set. At the Hotel Webster, She arranged flowers, oversaw the suite, and noted, "Went to my French lecture, came home to find my children, and brought them home to lunch with me." Later that spring, with law school behind them, Franklin and Eleanor sailed aboard the RMS Oceanic for a 3-month honeymoon. From Europe, Franklin's letters were breezy. "We are having a scrumptious time." Eleanor's were more revealing. "Dearest Mama, I look forward to our next long evening together, when I shall want to be kissed all the time. Ever and ever so much love, your devoted Eleanor." While they toured Europe, Sara choreographed their return. She leased a house for them on East 36th Street, 3 blocks from her own. She hired a butler, housemaid, and cook. The house was furnished to her taste. The life they returned to had already been chosen. Eleanor, aware of her domestic inexperience, welcomed the help. "You've done wonders for us," she wrote from Strasbourg. "I'm afraid my unaided efforts would not be very successful." Sara was pleased. She expected to remain ever present. As her biographer later wrote, it was part of her unconscious picture of the future, to share their responsibilities and decisions. In Manhattan, she dined with them often, then expected Franklin to escort her home. On weekends, she encouraged visits to Springwood. Franklin welcomed it. At Springwood, he was the favored son again, free to indulge in stamps, bird books, and long chats in the snuggery. Sara presided at the table. Franklin sat to her right. Eleanor was often off to the side or on the floor. All her life an outsider in the homes of others, wrote Blanche Wiesen Cook, Eleanor was once again on the periphery, and for a time accepted it. "I was beginning to be an entirely dependent person," Eleanor later wrote. At 21, Eleanor learned she was pregnant. Sara had already noticed the lingering queasiness after Europe and summoned a doctor. Haunted by her own traumatic labor, Sara was determined to be present. As the due date approached, she instructed her maid to lay out clothes nightly in case the call came. It came on the morning of May 3rd. At 1:15, a beautiful little girl was born. 10 pounds 1 ounce, Sara wrote in her diary. A nurse, Blanche Spring, oversaw the birth. Sara, meanwhile, tended to Franklin. "Dear Eleanor and baby doing well. Franklin dines every evening with me," she wrote, without irony. "Poor little Eleanor is upset, though brave," Sara added. Eleanor later recalled, "For the first year of my married life, I was completely taken care of." Sara made the decisions, when to feed, which doctor to call, which nurse to hire. When Anna cried at night, the nurse, not the mother, was expected to respond. Parenting guides urged mothers to be present to establish boundaries. But Sara's boundaries were internal and absolute. Eleanor occasionally objected. Franklin, ever conflict-averse, rarely intervened. And so, Sara became the silent center of their household. She maintained her routines, charities, French lessons, concerts at the Waldorf. But Franklin, Eleanor, and baby Anna remained her quiet priority. 2 weekends a month, and every holiday, the young family returned to Springwood. Often, Anna stayed behind. "I held baby from 6 to 7, Sara noted. "She was so lovely." She never openly criticized Eleanor's parenting. She didn't need to. Her diary recorded the interesting modern ideas of young mothers, like placing baby Anna in a chicken wire box outside a window for fresh air. The practice ended only when a neighbor, alarmed by the infant's cries, threatened to call the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Sara's judgments were subtle, but never missed. She occasionally expressed irritation with Franklin, especially when he neglected Eleanor. At Christmas 1906, Eleanor was unwell. Sara took her home early from a party. Franklin stayed and danced until dawn. The next morning, his cousin Corinne found him pale and sulking. Sara had scolded him and insisted he come down for breakfast at 8 a.m. Eleanor, meanwhile, had breakfast in bed. That same year, Franklin began an unpaid clerkship at one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms. Sara had arranged the position through her husband's old business partner. While the economy soared, factories booming, streets crowded with machines, Franklin walked to work through the roar of an industrializing nation. His firm often defended giants like Standard Oil and American Tobacco. A fellow clerk later recalled Franklin confiding his ambition. First, a seat in the state assembly, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and finally the governorship of New York. "I want to be president," he said, "and I think it's entirely reasonable." Sara and Eleanor remained unaware. Neither woman would have encouraged him. Sara disliked politics. Eleanor was immersed in motherhood. Over 10 years, she bore 6 children: Anna, James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., John, and a first Franklin Jr., who died in infancy. Sara hovered. She dispensed advice, summoned doctors, organized christenings, and often took the children to Hyde Park or Campobello. Each baby wore Franklin's christening gown. Franklin, affectionate but distracted, roughhoused and handed out treats. But parenting fell to Eleanor, and increasingly to Sara. She took many burdens off her daughter-in-law, wrote Rita Kleeman. But Eleanor was fading, moody, drained, distant. After her infant son's death in 1909, Eleanor collapsed inward. Sara kept vigil beside the child's body for 24 hours. After the funeral, Franklin and Eleanor returned to Manhattan. The 2 older children remained at Springwood, as Eleanor sunk into a deep depression. Even before her first grandchild was born, Sara had begun stitching herself more tightly into her son's life. Her 1905 Christmas gift was a drawing of a tall townhouse with smoke curling from its chimney. Construction began in spring. The home was not one, but 2 adjoining houses, one for Sara, one for Franklin and Eleanor. Each side had 15 rooms and 4 bathrooms. Sara selected the architect, paid for the build, and oversaw the furnishings. Eleanor, as was the case in the early years, left most decisions to Sara and Franklin. "All the arrangements seem very good," she wrote. Sara never knew that Eleanor found the house suffocating. Years later, Eleanor recalled a breakdown one evening when Franklin came home from work. "I said I did not like to live in a house that was not in any way mine, that I had done nothing about, that did not represent the way I wanted to live." Franklin, stunned, called her quite mad and walked out. Sara ignored the signs, or chose to. She continued her lunches with Eleanor, her outings with the couple, and her familiar role as grandmother. She avoided emotional disorder. Feelings, emotions were not things to be discussed. She recalled her brothers and sisters who had died in childhood, how they were never spoken about. Grief was private. In 1910, everything changed. Franklin entered what Sara still called the messy business of politics. Though he remained loyal to James's party, the Democrats, he accepted when local leaders asked him to run. His first move was to speak to Sara. She was not pleased. She had imagined Franklin following James's genteel example, but she adjusted, quickly. Many friends said it was a shame for so fine a young man to mix with dirty politicians, but I predicted the time would come when others from old families would enter politics. And there was a silver lining. "Franklin will be here now a great deal," she noted. The state capital was just 65 miles from Hyde Park. The odds were poor. His district hadn't elected a Democrat in 50 years. But the confident, well-connected candidate campaigned aggressively, traveling in a red roadster, out-organizing and outspending his opponent, backed by Sara's money. Franklin won by 1,140 votes. Within days, Sara was calling it Franklin's district. From then on, every campaign would begin, not with a rally, but on her porch. Franklin's victory reshaped more than his career. It altered the landscape of his marriage. He and Eleanor, without Sara, went to Albany to find a home. Days later, Sara arrived to inspect their choice, a large brownstone near the Capitol. "A fine house that could be made comfortable," she declared. It rented for $4,800, 3 times his Senate salary. Sara paid it. She helped Eleanor settle in with their 3 small children, 2 maids, a wet nurse, and other staff. Sara visited frequently, now driven in her new car, and sent produce and milk from Hyde Park. For the first time, Eleanor was no longer living beside her mother-in-law, and for the first time, she began to enjoy herself. She joined Franklin's political life more openly. Many colleagues found him arrogant. Francis Perkins, later Secretary of Labor, recalled him as aloof, not particularly charming, with an unfortunate habit of throwing his head back and looking down his nose at most people. But others were captivated. The New York Globe described him admiringly. Tall, physically fit to command, firm lips, white teeth, a Grecian nose, the glow of country health. Sara, of course, beamed, telling anyone who would listen, "That's the Delano side." In the years that followed, Franklin aligned himself with progressive causes, policies to protect farmers, women, and children. Sara approved and continued to preside at the Springwood table, even when the guests were unfamiliar, noisy, or unrefined. Only one issue caused friction: women's suffrage. Like Jennie Churchill, Sara believed women wielded real power behind the scenes. She distrusted the banners and marches. The vote seemed unnecessary. Franklin disagreed. Despite resistance from rural constituents, his wife and his mother, he supported suffrage. Eleanor followed, reluctantly. "I took it for granted that men were superior creatures," she later wrote. "If my husband was a suffragist, I probably must be too. I was not a feminist in those early years." She didn't join the women's suffrage party. She complied, but didn't yet believe. Sara, too, was unmoved by ideology. But once Franklin had made up his mind, she didn't object. She would have scoffed at the idea that men were naturally wiser, but saw no reason to quarrel with her son. Loyalty came first. When American women won the vote in 1920, 2 years after their British counterparts, Sara embraced her new right. From then on, she cast every ballot for her son. Not because she believed in the movement, but because she believed in him. In 1913, Franklin, now 31, left New York behind. After championing Woodrow Wilson's campaign, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. With Eleanor and their 3 children, he moved to Washington. Sara's presence, once constant, now required trains, transfers, and time. She boarded the New York Central at Hyde Park, silver hair swept up, hat boxes in tow. Her maid traveled second class. In Manhattan, she paused at East 65th Street. Then, on to Washington. The capital was evolving. Cherry trees bloomed along the tidal basin. The cathedral crept skyward. Franklin arrived with pedigree and purpose. His Albany record offered substance. His lineage opened doors. Franklin, with typical flair, wrote, "Dearest Mama, baptized, confirmed, sworn in, vaccinated, and somewhere at sea." Sara replied, lovingly but exacting, "You can't imagine the happiness you gave me. Try not to write your signature too small. So many public men have such awful signatures." Aunt Mamie Roosevelt offered them a townhouse on N Street, 4 stories, shaded by trees, just blocks from the Navy Department. It had no electricity, little room for a growing family, and belonged unmistakably to someone else. Once again, Eleanor stepped into another woman's house. Their income, about $20,000 a year, barely covered Franklin's indulgences, bespoke suits, club dues, endless books. Sara sent checks for repairs, but refused an allowance. She soon arrived to help. "My mother-in-law, as usual, helped us to get settled," Eleanor later noted, dryly. Franklin thrived. Charming, confident, and increasingly versed in naval affairs, he pushed for a massive fleet expansion. Though Wilson promised neutrality, Franklin sensed war coming. Sara followed his rise from Hyde Park, clipping articles into a scrapbook. He admired Churchill's boldness at the Admiralty. In 1915, Franklin tried to visit him, but Churchill, irked by American neutrality, declined. "No time," the ambassador said. Not the beginning either man would have predicted. Still, Sara remained the family's fixed star. At Campobello, a pine-shaded path linked her cottage to Franklin's. That summer, Eleanor and the chicks, as Franklin called the children, escaped Washington's heat for sea air. Eleanor played the political wife. Naval tours, formal calls, state dinners. In a letter, she wrote, "F doesn't have time to breathe, but he seems to thrive on it." And when she was away, Sara was there. "My mother-in-law always had an eye to the children, so there was no cause for anxiety," Eleanor later wrote. In August 1914, Sara heard Franklin calling. Eleanor had gone into early labor. Robe flying, Sara rushed across the lawn. Her 4th grandson, Franklin Jr., was born. As war broke out in Europe, Franklin was summoned back to Washington. He left quickly, knowing Sara would take charge. Less than a month later, she helped Eleanor and the children move to Hyde Park. "All going well," she wrote to Franklin. "Baby is a little fussy, I think because Eleanor was up late. Eleanor is cheerful and will go to bed early tonight." The family stayed for a month until Eleanor was strong enough to return. When John was born 2 years later, Sara arrived within hours. When whooping cough spread, she brought the older children north, read to them for hours, oversaw their schooling. The chicks spent weeks, even months with her, accompanied by nurses and governesses. "I was raised more by grandmother than by my parents," Anna later said. "She was the most solidly important adult in my childhood." Sara enforced decorum with a gentle hand. She scolded lateness, corrected table manners, but showered warmth. James would later say the fastest way to get what your parents refused was to ask Granny. One spring, James asked for a garden. Sara gave him land, seeds, and paid 50% over market for his vegetables. When Franklin objected, Sara was baffled. Surely, dear James should be rewarded for initiative. In 1917, as America entered the war, Eleanor joined the Red Cross canteen, serving sandwiches at Union Station, volunteering with shell-shocked veterans at St. Elizabeth's. With the children at Springwood, she wrote to Sara, "How lucky we are to have you. Very few mothers mean as much to their daughters as you do to me." Springwood grew with the family. Sara added new wings, a third floor, and 7 bathrooms. She oversaw the building of a grand library with twin marble fireplaces and Roosevelt coats of arms. There, Franklin worked on his stamp collection, studied naval maps, met guests. In the front hall, his childhood bird specimens were displayed behind glass, a boyhood curated by Sara. Photos soon showed Franklin on the portico, flanked by his mother and wife, projecting command, charm, continuity. But beneath the public image, one truth remained. The house he stood in was hers. She had laid every stone. But the true test came in 1918. Franklin, then in Washington, had begun an affair. The woman was Lucy Mercer, 23, beautiful, poised, Eleanor's part-time secretary. Gentle where mother had a schoolmarm's air, Elliot Roosevelt said, outgoing where mother was introverted. Sara approved of her. So sweet and attractive, she had written from Washington. She adores you, Eleanor. No one knew the truth. While Eleanor summered at Campobello, Franklin took Lucy on drives in his Stutz or aboard the Navy's yacht, Sylph. The affair had likely begun in 1916. Eleanor, perhaps sensing something, wrote to Sara on her wedding anniversary, "You'll never know how grateful I am for what Franklin has given me and what you have done to make it so." Then Franklin left for Europe. He toured battlefields, met kings and ministers, was snubbed by Churchill, a stinker, he would later say. On the return voyage aboard the Leviathan, he collapsed. Spanish flu, then double pneumonia. He lay near death as the ship creaked through the waves and the dead were buried at sea. Sara and Eleanor met the ship in New York. Franklin was carried into Sara's house on East 65th Street. Sara oversaw the orderlies. Eleanor unpacked his cases and found the letters. Lucy's letters. "The bottom dropped out of my world," Eleanor later told her daughter Anna. Her father's betrayal had returned in Franklin's hands. What followed was never recorded in Sara's diary. Those pages are missing. The affair went unmentioned until long after they were gone. Eleanor never addressed it in her memoirs. Washington knew, but said nothing. Still, the emotional choreography is clear. Eleanor, shattered, offered Franklin the chance to leave. Sara, calm, unsparing, did not. Her voice, low but unyielding, told her son, "If you leave Eleanor, you will not receive another dollar." Franklin might have left Eleanor, but he knew he could never leave Sara. Franklin stayed. The affair ended. The marriage endured, but changed. Eleanor withdrew. As she told Anna years later, "That's when I moved out of our room." After the crisis, Sara returned to control. She arranged for Franklin to oversee demobilization in Europe. When Secretary Daniels hesitated, she paid him a visit. On January 1st, 1919, Franklin and Eleanor sailed to Paris. Sara resumed command, organizing the household, keeping the youngest children in Manhattan, installing Hyde Park's first electric washing machine, and each night, singing hymns with the boys before bed. Eleanor wrote warm letters from the peace conference. "I hope we never have to separate again. I think I'm becoming a clinging vine." But something had shifted. Her letters grew careful. Her emotional dependence unraveled. "I'm so sorry I hurt you, Mummy dear," she wrote. "Of course, you know I love Franklin and the children dearly and am deeply devoted to you." In a quieter note to Franklin, Eleanor said that Sara and her sisters, with their serene assurance and absolute judgments, made her want to squirm and turn Bolshevik. That spring, Eleanor returned to Campobello. Franklin went to San Francisco for the Democratic National Convention. Sara welcomed the children to Hyde Park and wrote often, running barefoot, swimming, all rosy and well. On June 25th, she added, "I'm sure San Francisco will be most interesting, and I hope elevating, as the old letters used to say. But I fancy that's not very likely in a crowd of every sort of politician." She never loved politics. But when the telegram arrived, Franklin had been nominated as James Cox's running mate. She was thrilled. Sara replied at once, "You must stop the train at Hyde Park. Your friends want to welcome you home." If and when you are elected, you will belong to the nation. But for now, you are our boy of Hyde Park. Eleanor, now at Campobello, learned of the nomination through Sara. Her reply was telling, "Whatever Franklin achieves must be largely due to you." Sara cherished it and copied it into her diary. 2 months after the 1920 election, during his official nomination for vice president, 5,000 guests packed Springwood. Sara stood proudly among them as Franklin, from the portico, declared, "We oppose money in politics, the private control of national finances, and the treatment of human beings as commodities." The Cox-Roosevelt ticket lost badly, but Franklin returned to New York energized, already thinking of the next campaign. In 1921, Sara resumed her tradition of European travel. From London, she sent Franklin a jaunty note about her boldest move yet, a twin-engine flight to Paris. He was horrified. "Don't do it again," he cabled. She returned to New York in late August aboard a luxury liner. But it wasn't Franklin who met her. It was her brother and stepson. Her brother delivered the news. Franklin had polio. Sara hid her shock. "Well, son," she told him on arrival, "this strikes me as a queer party to give me on my return." Her vibrant son now lay in bed, unable to lift his arm above his shoulders. Eleanor and Lewis Howe were bathing, feeding, and comforting him. She wrote a friend, "Below his waist he cannot move at all. His legs, that I have always been proud of, must be shifted often, or they ache." She believed only one path remained. Franklin must abandon politics. Return to Springwood. Live as his father had. The future she had imagined for him was collapsing. But Franklin refused. Much like Sara, he would not quit. For 7 years, he searched for recovery in warm southern waters, first on a Florida houseboat, then in the mineral springs of Georgia. He was often accompanied not by family, but by his secretary, Missy LeHand. Sara disliked how Missy guarded Franklin's time. Rumors of an affair swirled. Eleanor ignored them. She was now finding her own voice, and Lewis Howe drew her into politics. He saw the mind that had slept since Allenswood and challenged her to use it. Even after polio, Howe refused to let Franklin fade. He pushed Eleanor into the spotlight to keep his name alive. She rose to the challenge, joining the New York State Democratic Party's women's division and forging ties with unions and reformers. It helped that she had space, away from Springwood and from Sara. Sara still believed by encouraging Franklin to give up politics, she was protecting him. Her grandson James recalled, "She was bitterly opposed to father's return to public life after he was paralyzed. She fought Howe and mother on this." Sara could not fathom the struggle in his third-floor bedroom. Franklin hoisting his legs with a towel, willing dead limbs to obey. Nor could she understand why Eleanor and Howe insisted on filling the house with political visitors. Sara appeared, uninvited, through the connecting door between their Manhattan homes, trying to control the situation as she always had. Eleanor blocked the door between their homes. Mother fluttered with rage. Granny stood rigid, jaw outthrust in indignation. Anna said. Sara saw her son and Eleanor as selfish, caring more for ambition than their children. She encouraged Anna's resentment toward her parents. The children, then aged 5 to 15, were now looked after mostly by Sara. When measles and mumps spread, she hired a nurse. She brought the children to Springwood for the summer, arranged governesses, and smoothed tensions Eleanor no longer had time to address. That spring, she swept James and Anna off to Europe. But in Versailles, Sara herself fell, tripping on a stone step and spending days in bed while the children explored the city alone. More and more, it was Sara, not Eleanor, whom the children turned to in crisis. James recalled how when he fell ill at school, it was Sara, not his parents, who came to bring him home. Still, she remained involved with Eleanor and Franklin. When Eleanor began hosting political gatherings, Sara arranged the luncheons. She presided, but gave Eleanor the floor. Whether it was affection, strategy, or evolution, she had become more open-minded than before. Then came Madison Square Garden, June 1924. After 3 years out of public life, Franklin stepped forward to nominate Al Smith for president. He still couldn't walk unaided, refused a wheelchair, and rehearsed for weeks with 16-year-old James in their home library. "He leaned on me so hard it hurt," James said. His breathing was labored. His hands were wet with sweat. At the podium, James handed him the second crutch. Franklin, with fierce resolve, walked 15 feet alone, The crowd of 12,000 delegates watched in silence, then erupted. A 3-minute ovation shook the arena. Later, Sara told her biographer that a shaft of light fell through a crack in the roof and touched her son's head like a halo. At home, she clipped the story. Win or lose, Roosevelt stands out as real hero of convention. Did she believe the halo? Or the headline? For once, it didn't matter. The path was re-emerging, and this time, Sara let him walk it. By 1925, Franklin had begun treatment with Dr. William MacDonald, a Massachusetts physician. Sara was hopeful. Once he can walk with crutches and without braces, strength will follow, she wrote. For the first time in over a year, I feel work is being done for you, my dearest. But the emotional strain within the family deepened. Eleanor's dependence gave way to quiet resentment. Sara, fiercely attached to the children, once told them, "I am more your mother than she is." Eleanor was livid. A guest overheard Sara scolding her for arriving at dinner without brushing her hair. Franklin, ever conflict avoidant, arranged a quiet solution. In 1926, Eleanor moved into a modest stone cottage called Val-Kill, a mile from Springwood. There she found freedom and friendship with Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. Val-Kill became her refuge, from Springwood, from marriage, from the mother-in-law who still believed she belonged elsewhere. Sara was baffled. "She belongs here," she told friends. "I don't know why she goes over there every night. If she wants to swim, she can do that during the day." The children sensed the growing divide. "Granny moved with unflagging firmness to fill the gap," Eliot wrote. "Father was too sick to be fully present. Mother was bent on building a life of her own." Sara signed the checks and made the rules. When Franklin Jr. and John lost their pony as punishment, she bought them horses. When Anna married a stockbroker without telling her parents, Sara gave them an apartment. Eleanor wrote to Franklin, "It's all I can do to be decent." Yet the children adored her. James said, "We were lucky to have a grandmother who would do for us when we had a mother who would not, and a father who could not." Sara's role began to shift. Eleanor had her own voice now. What Sara thought became less and less important, James wrote. In 1926, she quietly funded a library in Hyde Park in her husband's memory, paying for it herself despite Franklin's concerns. Her siblings were dying off. Only Fred, Dora, and Cassie remained. Dora, now in Paris, became her confidant. Age crept in. Sara still dressed elegantly but used a motorized tricycle in private. She walked unaided in public, but pain had settled in her eyes. In 1928, she was at Warm Springs when Franklin was asked to run for governor. His doctor advised against it. So did Sara. When he agreed, he told the delegation, "Don't let my mother know." But Sara found out. "If this costs me my son," she snapped, "I shall never forgive you." Yet she rallied. "If he does run," she told friends, "I hope he wins." She contributed to his campaign and wrote, "If you're elected and the salary is less, I will make up the difference." On election night, early headlines declared defeat. But Sara stayed up, seated by the tally desk. At 4 a.m., the tide turned, and Franklin won. Sara nearly ran up the steps at Springwood, and she were once again part of her son's future. While Eleanor taught in Manhattan, Sara acted as First Lady of New York. Missy LeHand managed the household. Frances Perkins recalled seeing Sara on the lawn, reading in a wicker chair, hair curled, Franklin and Eleanor nearby. Her devotion to her son's incomprehensible taste for politics took her over the hurdles, Perkins said. She became friends with people she'd never have met otherwise. Still, Eleanor resented Sara's lavish gifts, cars for the boys, cash to Anna and James. Franklin refused to intervene. Sara had funded his career. His assent returned her to her favorite role, the mother behind the man. She beamed when he won re-election in 1930, as whispers of a presidential run began. In 1931, a telegram arrived. Sara had pneumonia in Paris. Gravely ill, she was in the American hospital. Franklin canceled everything and boarded the Aquitania. Sara insisted on sitting up when he arrived. Her bed had been moved to face the garden, but that day she watched the door. When it opened, she recalled, and that handsome son of mine stood there with his arm around his own tall son, I was very emotional. I was still very weak. Eliot credited her recovery to Granny's iron will. Back home, Lewis Howe persuaded her to give an interview for Good Housekeeping. She complied, reluctantly. The articles became the book My Boy Franklin. She hated the publicity. When she saw ads on hearse trucks, she was appalled. "My name is going all over town on trucks." She especially hated the mention of too much chloroform during childbirth. When the authors returned, she waved them off. "I can't remember anything else." "Mama is like that," Franklin said, then picked up the pen and finished the story she had carried for so long but could no longer bear to tell. She had shaped his world in silence and steel. Now, at last, she laid it down. In the early hours of July 1st, 1932, Sara sat with Franklin and Eleanor at the Albany governor's mansion, listening to radio updates from the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Franklin smoked. Eleanor knitted. By the fourth ballot, he secured the Democratic nomination for president. At 10:32 p.m., the organ struck up "Happy Days Are Here Again." Sara beamed. Franklin flew to Chicago. As the plane took off, he dictated, "All well, much love, FDR." After landing, he phoned his mother, then entered the stadium to thunderous applause. When reporters asked for comment, Sara replied, "Of course I'm glad, but I wasn't very much surprised." On the radio, she heard Franklin proclaim, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." The words would have scandalized her father, who had once said, "Not all Democrats are horse thieves, but all horse thieves are Democrats." But Sara had changed. Born before the Civil War, raised to revere order and bloodline, she had embraced something far more radical, a son who defied the world she came from, and a love that made her let him. The Republicans were crushed. When Franklin returned to East 65th Street, Sara was waiting, weeping with pride. "This is the greatest night of my life," he told her. He would be president for the rest of her life, and his. Sara embraced public life. Once reluctant, she now took pleasure in ceremony. She rode the inaugural train, and at dinners and balls, she glowed. A week before the inauguration, My Boy Franklin was published. Time placed her, not Franklin, on the cover. Few mothers, it wrote, have known the exaltation that Sara Delano Roosevelt will feel. On Inauguration Day, she rose early. In her long coat and fox fur, she sat near the podium. That night, 72 Roosevelts and Delanos gathered for the inaugural dinner. Her spine was straight, her eyes commanding, her pearls gleaming, recalled Eliot. She was majestic. The White House soon became a small, intimate hotel. Guests came and went. Expenses ballooned. Sara subsidized the presidency with $100,000 a year. She met Franklin's guests, scheduled his visitors, and made sure her banker friends were seen. Staff called her the Duchess. In May 1933, she was named Mother of the Year. Her Mother's Day broadcast echoed her son's fireside tone. "My son, the president, has lifted this day above sentiment. Millions of mothers pray not for candy, but for bread." Sara became a symbolic presence, admired, dignified, untouchable. Literary Digest compared her to a queen mother. In England, she dined with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and took tea with King George. Newsweek placed her on the cover. But she came to the White House less. She preferred Hyde Park. Franklin, amid global crisis, visited often, every few weeks. The estate became the summer White House. Sentry boxes appeared. New phone lines were strung. Sara always greeted him on the portico. She still fussed. He still smiled. And he always left feeling restored. She hosted guests with elegance. Bishops, labor leaders, socialites. Only Huey Long drew her disdain. "Who is that horrible man?" she asked Eleanor. "I feel sorry for Franklin," Long later muttered. "He's got more SOBs in his family than I got in mine." On her 80th birthday, Eleanor hosted a party at Springwood, and Franklin toasted, "To the best mother in the land." Her grandchildren presented a scroll. "Hyde Park means you, and all the fun you gave us there." But as Franklin's duties grew, Sara saw him less. Then came 1939. That June, royalty came to Hyde Park. Franklin had invited King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to solidify ties as Europe edged toward war. In Washington, a record crowd cheered their parade. But at Springwood, history turned personal. Sara, regal in pearls and silk, welcomed them at the door. On her piano sat autographed portraits of royalty. To her, Eliot wrote, reigning monarchs were among the few who matched her dignity. She became the first American woman to entertain a British monarch in her home, but she disliked the picnic menu, hot dogs and strawberry shortcake. "My mother thinks you should have tea," Franklin quipped. "My mother would have said the same," the king replied. At the formal dinner, Sara's butler was offended by White House staff. A folding table collapsed, shattering china. Still, the evening triumphed. That night, the king told his prime minister, "Why don't my ministers talk to me like the president?" I felt like a son being advised by a wise father. The china was broken, but the illusion held. Sara's final state occasion was her finest. She was 85. Her joints ached, but her purpose endured. "Perhaps I've lived too long," she told Franklin, "but when I hear your voice, I never want to leave you." That summer, when Germany and the Soviets signed a pact, she rushed home from Europe. "I want to relieve my son of any anxiety in this crisis," she said as she boarded the ship. Back at Hyde Park, she was often alone. Franklin had war to prepare. Eleanor had speeches, travels, her My Day column. Still, she made time for Sara. Visits, family updates, walks in New York. Franklin visited more than ever. 56 days during the 1940 campaign. He asked her to consider a companion. She refused. That fall, he won a third term. Sara stood beside him on the portico as torchbearers paraded past. "I am now a mother of history," she said. "When you read history, it seems most presidents didn't have mothers, the way they fail to appear." Sara's body was aging, but her presence was indelible. She had built the world he walked through, and watched him remake the world in return. In January 1941, reporters watched as Sara walked slowly onto the inaugural platform, leaning on a polished cane. "She moved more slowly than in 33, wrote the Washington Star. That summer, she made one final journey to Campobello, still requiring ferries, trains, and ladder climbs. Eleanor came with her and saw how much she struggled. Sara now accepted help. A nurse from Boston arrived. Kathleen Crawford, a quiet companion, read to her and helped her dress. Franklin sent a note. "Dearest Mama, I'm so glad you're feeling better and that you do what the nurse says." Sara dictated her reply. "We have a lovely day and I'm sitting in a sunny window. I think laziness is my chief trouble. I think of you night and day." But she rarely left her room. Her heart was failing. Her memory, too. She left Campobello in August, stopping in Manhattan, then returning home to Springwood. Eleanor met her there. The next morning at breakfast, she noticed Sara's pallor, her breath catching. She called Franklin. He wired back, "Catching the overnight train." Sara brightened. "I'll greet him on the portico," she promised. But the next morning, she couldn't stand. Instead, she was propped on the chaise at the foot of the bed, where 59 years earlier, she had given birth to the man who would help give America strength during one of its darkest nights. Her white hair was braided and tied with a blue ribbon. She waited. Tires crunched in the drive. The elevator whined. Franklin wheeled into the room, beaming. He stayed all day, talking softly, remembering the past, pausing only for urgent telegrams. He shared one special confidence: the secret summit in Argentia. The man who once dismissed him, Winston Churchill, had pressed him to act. He puffed cigars, invoked destiny, charmed like his mother before him. Franklin listened, smiled, sidestepped. He had long practiced the art of saying no gently, first with Sara. Still, he saw something rare in Churchill: resolve, vision, kinship. A bond had formed. The world was turning, and the woman who shaped his steadiness, his self-belief, was fading beside him. As the sun dropped behind the Hudson, Sara dozed. Franklin kissed her cheek and rolled downstairs for dinner. The family agreed. She just needed rest. But by 9:30 p.m., her nurse realized Sara had slipped into a coma. Franklin returned to her room and sat silent beside the woman who taught him resilience, pride, and poise, and watched her slip away. He stayed the night beside her. At noon the next day, Sunday, September 7, 1941, Sara Delano Roosevelt died. Her passing was as she had lived, composed, dignified, serene. Franklin canceled his schedule. Eleanor arranged the funeral at St. James Church. At the burial, Franklin stood dry-eyed as her coffin was lowered beside James's. Days later, in his new presidential archive, an aide handed him a box, wrapped in tissue, each item labeled in Sara's unmistakable hand. Her wedding gloves, his baby shoes, a lock of his hair, school letters tied with ribbon. He wept. It was the first time any staffer had seen the president cry. Eleanor offered a tribute in My Day. A very vital person whose strongest trait was loyalty to her family. There was a streak of jealousy and possessiveness. But privately, she said more. "I looked at her face after she died and understood so many things. It is dreadful to live so close to someone for 36 years and feel no deep affection. or sense of loss. Even decades later, Eleanor struggled with her emotions. Sara had rescued her marriage, had given her financial security, had in silence freed her from the duties of motherhood so she could become the Eleanor Roosevelt remembered today. But neither woman ever said the words that might have healed them. Sara was born before electricity, before the telephone, before the Civil War. In a house of order and refinement, where the bell rang for breakfast and governesses taught Latin beneath the beech trees of Algonac. Her father stitched her scalp without flinching. Her mother played nocturnes on the piano with hands that never trembled. She was raised to be composed, exacting, and silent in her sorrows, burying sisters and brothers and grief. But behind that composure was a force of nature. Sara crossed the oceans of the 19th century, the South China Sea, the storm-swept Atlantic, the drawing rooms of Paris, and returned with a spine of steel and a mind trained to command. She did not hunger for attention, but she refused to be ignored. She married late, chose carefully, and when her son was born, she did not simply love him, she shaped him. She nursed him, schooled him, shadowed him, protected him. When others gave their children to nannies, Sara kept hers. When Eleanor struggled with infants, Sara stepped in. When Franklin stumbled, she steadied. She kept his baby shoes, his letters, his future. She paid his tuition, his campaign bills, his rent. She built his house, 2 of them actually, and left doors connecting them to hers. When he fell ill with polio, it was Sara who paid for the train, arranged the hospital, and sat quietly in the hallway as Eleanor took over. She tried to convince him to retire. He refused. And though it broke every instinct in her body, she let him go. And when years later, he crossed the stage at Madison Square Garden on 2 crutches to nominate Al Smith, she said she saw a shaft of light fall through the roof and touch his head like a halo. Did she believe in halos? Maybe not. But she believed in Franklin. And when he became president, it was Sara who laid out her pearls. Sara who boarded the inaugural train. Sara who stood in the snow as her boy took the oath. She stood by him at Hyde Park, sent eggs, paid bills, managed staff, greeted monarchs. She took tea with kings. She told off Huey Long. She gave her son to a nation, but she never gave him up. When the world grew louder, she grew quieter. When Eleanor found her voice, Sara let her speak. When the grandchildren floundered, she was their anchor. And when Franklin stood at the center of history, she stood just behind him. Composed, braided, steady. And in the end, it was Sara, not society, not scandal, not even war, who gave the world Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not by ambition, but by belief. She paid for every stone. She laid the path, and she stayed just long enough to watch him walk it. A woman forged in silence, who gave her strength, not her name. Who built a president and vanished into the shadow of his greatness. Not forgotten, just folded into the story he became. Still there, still standing, even when the world no longer looked back. Jennie Jerome Churchill's life was a tempest of scandal, ambition, and audacious defiance. She shattered New York society by marrying into one of England's most powerful families, sparring with duchesses and stealing the heart of a future king. She weathered the public disgrace of her husband's downfall, the whispers of infidelity, and the shockwaves of marrying not 1 but 2 men, decades her junior. But Jennie was far more than the sum of her scandals. She braved wartime hospital ships, championed causes with courage, penned plays laced with her own struggles, and soared into the skies in her 60s. Most enduringly, she nurtured the genius of Winston Churchill, her unshakable faith lifting him through the shadows of failure into the light of greatness. From the glittering ballrooms of New York to the hallowed halls of Blenheim, from private heartbreak to public triumph, Jennie's story is one of resilience, reinvention, and relentless determination. She defied convention, she shattered expectations, and she left an indelible mark on history. This is a tale of love and loss, of daring and devotion, and the unstoppable spirit of a woman who changed the world. On January 9th, 1854, in Brooklyn, New York, Jennie Jerome entered the world, the second of 4 daughters in a family marked by both privilege and secrecy. Her father, Leonard Jerome, inspired by his admiration for the opera singer Jenny Lind, chose Jennie's name, a detail that sparked her mother Clara's exclamation, "What, just plain Jennie?" Clara, having inherited a substantial fortune after losing both parents at the tender age of 2, bore a lineage mingled with revolutionary heroism, where both her grandfathers had fought in the Revolution and rumored Native American ancestry, a heritage deemed unspeakable in their circles, but something Winston would grow quite proud of in his later years. Leonard Jerome, a charismatic figure, navigated through fluctuating fortunes with the ease of a seasoned speculator, his life punctuated by both splendid gains and staggering losses. Beyond his financial escapades, his scandalous love affairs added layers of distress to Clara's life, further isolating her within their social stratum. The Jerome family grew with the addition of 2 more daughters, Leonie and Camille. However, their lives were shadowed by tragedy when young Camille succumbed to a fever at the age of 7, a loss that deeply scarred the family fabric. Jennie Jerome's childhood sparkled with the grandeur of her father, Leonard's most affluent years. Together, they would charge through the park in his 4-in-hand carriage, their speed eliciting shouts from startled pedestrians. Their social calendar brimmed with visits to the theater and summers in Newport, while Jennie enjoyed horseback rides on her own pony in front of their 6-story Manhattan mansion. This palatial home boasted a 3-story stable and was the venue for Leonard's lavish balls, where fountains sprayed cologne and champagne, epitomizing the excess of their lifestyle. Leonard, a speculator and part owner of the New York Times, capitalized on insider information during the Civil War, supporting Union causes generously. However, once peace was restored, his contributions shifted towards aiding the South's reconstruction. His numerous romantic affairs and the rumors of illegitimate children strained his marriage with Clara, exacerbating her exclusion from New York's elite Astor 400. This rejection, coupled with her own unfulfilled marital life, prompted Clara to redirect her focus towards Europe, a place she deemed more suitable for her daughters to secure aristocratic marriages. 4 years following the death of her youngest daughter, Clara, determined and hopeful, relocated to Paris with her daughters. At this juncture, Leonard's fortunes were faltering amidst whispers of scandalous investments. He concurred that their departure was prudent, promising to visit whenever possible. To maintain social grace, Clara attributed their move to health reasons, claiming the European air would be beneficial, and there was never any mention of divorce, for even its whisper could harm her daughter's prospects. In 1867, as Jennie Jerome neared her 13th birthday, her family arrived in Paris during the zenith of the Second Empire. The Jerome family quickly found favor within the city's elite circles. Empress Eugenie, charmed by her own American grandfather's heritage, was particularly taken with the spirited Americans. Clara and her eldest daughter, Clarita, were soon fixtures at court, embraced by the regal ambiance of their new environs. Jennie, meanwhile, flourished academically and artistically at a prestigious Parisian school, mastering the piano to such an extent that she was invited to perform at a salon hosted by Princess Matilda. However, it was Princess Pauline Metternich who left an indelible mark on young Jennie. Known for her sharp wit, vibrant persona, and impeccable fashion sense, Metternich was a celebrated muse for the era's foremost writers and musicians, and a fervent patron of the arts. Jennie, captivated by Metternich's distinctive style and the revolutionary designs of her dressmaker Charles Worth, who was reshaping European haute couture, became a devoted client. Yet, the resplendent world of balls and soirees came to an abrupt halt in 1870 as Prussian forces advanced on France. The French suffered a series of devastating defeats, leading to the capture of the emperor and a swift, bloodless revolution that saw the fall of Napoleon III. Paris, besieged and beleaguered, endured until January 1871 amidst a harrowing famine. With their belongings in hand and others pushed in a wheelbarrow, the Jeromes managed to secure passage on the last train from Paris, eventually finding refuge on a vessel bound for England. They landed in Brighton and made their way to London. Jennie found the gloom and fog of London depressing and pined for Paris. They spent summers on the Isle of Wight in the village of Cowes, next to the exiled Princess Eugenie, with whom the family often took walks. Queen Victoria often stayed on the Isle of Wight in the summer, and the Jerome girls were invited to all the smartest parties. On August 12, 1873, Jennie and Lord Randolph Churchill's paths crossed at an elegant ball. Randolph, the 23-year-old second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, was instantly smitten with 19-year-old Jennie after just one dance. His affection was swiftly reciprocated. Randolph, known for his charm and charismatic presence, was initially in Cowes for leisure, indulging his love for hounds and hunting. Yet, upon encountering Jennie, he sought a formal introduction, captivated by her vibrant spirit and intellect. Unlike his more fragile sisters, Jennie was robust, well-read, an accomplished horsewoman, and possessed a maturity that belied her years. Her lively mind and spirited conversation led Randolph to perceive her as a woman of exceptional depth and wisdom. Jennie, in turn, was drawn to Randolph's originality and the refreshing novelty of his ideas. Enamored, she suggested inviting him to dinner the following evening. During that intimate gathering, their connection deepened, and by the end of the night, Randolph confided to a friend his resolve to marry her. The following evening, after another dinner, the couple strolled through the orchard where Randolph proposed, and Jennie joyfully accepted. Although Randolph had to depart Cowes for business commitments, the couple exchanged heartfelt promises and tokens of their love. Upon his departure, Jennie revealed their engagement to her mother, who expressed dismay, possibly concerned by the rapid progression of their courtship or the precedence of Jennie's engagement over her older sister. Undeterred, Jennie reassured Randolph in her correspondence that her mother's approval would eventually be won over, adding a tender postscript that playfully admonished him not to smoke excessively. Randolph grappled with familial challenges, particularly with his father, John Winston Spencer Churchill, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, a staunch Victorian who deemed the Jeromes mere adventurers beneath their station. He disparaged Leonard as a vulgar kind of man and not respectable. However, compelled by his family's frequent financial straits, he reluctantly agreed to the match, only for Leonard to withdraw his consent when the Churchills wanted all the money to go to Randolph. This sparked a prolonged exchange of bitter correspondence between the two families, embroiling Randolph and Jennie in a saga of negotiations that would last for years. Throughout this period, Randolph and Jennie sustained their bond through secret meetings and a stream of fervent letters. During one memorable visit to Cowes, Randolph introduced Jennie to the Prince of Wales, who commended his choice. However, by September, the Jeromes returned to Paris, initiating a phase of intense, often reproachful letter writing, with Jennie leading a reclusive life. By the following October, Randolph crossed the Channel, meeting Jennie clandestinely, and they had their first kiss. As gossip about their engagement spread, Randolph's father pressured him to stand for MP in Woodstock, a position he had once held. Though hesitant, Randolph was persuaded by Jennie's encouragement about his potential as a reformative speaker. He won the seat easily, though it provided no salary, further straining their financial situation. After his electoral victory, Randolph hastened to Paris. Amid ongoing parental negotiations, it is speculated that during this visit, Jennie and Randolph decisively acted, resulting in Jennie's pregnancy. This is substantiated by the timing of Winston's birth exactly 9 months later. Despite persistent financial wrangling by both families, the wedding plans proceeded. They eventually settled on a dowry of £50,000, with half going directly to Jennie and the remainder to Randolph. On April 15, 1874, in a dual ceremony at the British Embassy in Paris, an Anglican service followed by an American one, Jennie and Randolph were married. Leonard proudly attended his favorite daughter's wedding, though the Marlboroughs were notably absent. Following their nuptials, Jennie and Randolph Churchill journeyed back to the heart of England, to the majestic Blenheim Castle. This architectural marvel, bestowed upon John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, by Queen Anne in 1705, was a token of gratitude for his valor in battle. Designed to rival the grandeur of Versailles, the palace was a tangible echo of regal and martial glory. As Jennie first laid eyes on the vast landscapes and the stately structure, she was enveloped in awe. The beauty of Blenheim was overwhelming, its grandiosity stirring a deep admiration within her. An emotion so profound, yet her steadfast American pride whispered to keep such awe unspoken to her father. The daily life at Blenheim was a tapestry of antiquated rituals and formalities, each day unfolding like a carefully choreographed ballet. Mornings were dedicated to the quiet contemplation of newspapers, an intellectual prelude to the evening's political discourse. The afternoons offered genteel excursions, a carriage ride to a neighbor's estate, or a leisurely stroll through the meticulously manicured gardens. Each moment designed to gracefully bridge the hours. Evenings at the palace were a portrait of Victorian formality. Following stately dinners, they would retreat to the Van Dyke room for intellectual pursuits or cards by candlelight. Occasionally, a surreptitious hand would nudge the clock forward, a silent concession to the collective fatigue, yet no one would dare suggest an early night before the appointed hour. At precisely 11, the proposal for bed was made, and the family would ascend to their chambers, candlestick in hand, only to rise and repeat the cycle anew. Tea time, too, was an affair of elaborate courtesies, followed by an enforced rest where she would have to retire to her chamber and wait for supper. She found her in-laws cold and unwelcoming, and the forced formality and endless repetition stifled her. In May, the couple moved to London for the season, and Jennie captivated high society at dinners and balls. It was a whirl of excitement, she said, and all of London wanted to meet the young American. However, the season itself had to be cut short as Jennie began to experience morning sickness and her pregnancy began to show. Her confinement was planned for mid-September, which suggests the Marlboroughs must have had some inkling that the child had been conceived prior to April. As if the child had been conceived on the day of their wedding, the due date would have been in January, and confinement would have begun in November. In addition, a child born 2 months premature would have had a very low survival rate and likely been underdeveloped. Yet Winston was born healthy and strong on Monday, November 30th, 1874, at 1:30 a.m. In the morning, the bells of Woodstock tolled for his arrival. Jennie did not nurse her son, as duties were handed over to a wet nurse, and she would flitter in and out of her young boy's life for the next 15 years. Whatever thaw her relationship had with the Duchess when Winston was born soon cooled again after Randolph's older brother George gave her a ring that was actually his wife's. Jennie had no idea it had belonged to her, and it is likely George, who is called Blandford, was simply trying to make mischief. Though the event escalated into a squabble between the two brothers, the Duchess placed most of the blame on Jennie. "I had wished to be more of a mother-in-law to you," she chided. "Perhaps I was wrong." She always thought Jennie of low morals, perhaps because she was American, or perhaps the premature birth, but Randolph had always been her favorite, and the biggest reason she resented Jennie was that she had displaced her in her son's affections. Though soon, the family squabble would give way to a much larger one that involved the prince himself and was felt for years to come. In October 1875, the Prince of Wales embarked on a grand tour of India with Lord Aylesford among the dignitaries. Meanwhile, Aylesford's wife, Edith, engaged in an open affair with Jennie's brother-in-law, Blandford. As Aylesford journeyed through India, Blandford openly cohabitated near Edith's residence. When the scandal erupted, alarming cables greeted the royal party at each port. In Nepal, the Prince of Wales infamously denounced George as the greatest blackguard alive. By early 1876, Blandford and Lady Aylesford eloped, compelling Blandford to seek a legal separation. Lady Aylesford, having left behind 3 children, appealed to her mother-in-law for their care. Previously, the prince himself had been romantically involved with Lady Aylesford. In a twist, after the prince's disparaging remarks, she disclosed his love letters to Blandford, who then showed them to Randolph. Driven by a misguided sense of loyalty, Randolph took the letters to Princess Alexandra, threatening their disclosure in court. The prince, incensed by this breach, challenged Randolph to a duel. Randolph dismissed the challenge as cowardly and offered an apology to Princess Alexandra, but the reputational damage was irreversible. The prince vowed to shun the Churchills and avoid any London residence they frequented. Lord Aylesford was strongly advised against divorce and subsequently relocated to Texas, where he embraced a life of farming and drinking, dying in 1885 at the age of 35. Blandford and Lady Aylesford had a son in 1881, but never married. Throughout these tribulations, the Duke maintained a stoic silence. To mitigate the fallout, He accepted the role of Viceroy of Ireland, appointing Randolph as his private secretary. This appointment led Jennie, Winston, and the Duchess to relocate to Ireland, marking a necessary retreat from the scandal that had enveloped their lives. In the lush landscapes of Ireland, Jennie Jerome found herself in a gilded yet confining cage. Overseen by the watchful Duchess, she felt her freedom diminish. Meanwhile, Randolph, battling severe bouts of illness, believed by historians to be syphilis, spent much of his time away, seeking treatments in London or France, or retreating to the remote fishing rivers of Norway. His letters, filled with affection, yet devoid of intimacy, hinted at a marriage transforming into more of a cordial companionship. The origin of Randolph's illness remains veiled in controversy. Some suggest a reckless encounter at university, others a more mundane liaison with a housemaid. His increasing absences, marked by missed birthdays and anniversaries, signaled a shift in their relationship, steering it towards a platonic partnership rooted in mutual respect, rather than romantic love. Jennie, always a romantic, felt lonely and isolated. She immersed herself in the arts, singing, painting, piano, and horse riding filling her days. It was during this time, around 1880, that her life began to intertwine with Star Falmouth, later the 7th Viscount Falmouth, a charismatic military man who shared her love for hunting and racing. Known in her letters as a frequent visitor, his presence sparked rumors that he might be more than just a friend. Her letters speak playfully of their interactions, and he would often visit in late afternoons when the servants were away. Amidst these swirling rumors, Jennie gave birth to her second son, John Strange Spencer Churchill, on February 4, 1880. While her sisters whispered about John's paternity, the reality remained shrouded in discretion. Regardless of the paternal mystery, Winston always loved his younger brother, whereas Randolph treated him exactly as he did Winston, with complete indifference. The general election of 1880 brought a shift in leadership and marked the end of the family's tenure in Ireland, heralding a seismic change in Jennie's life. Returning to England, Randolph retained his seat as MP for Woodstock, immersing himself in the fervor of politics. Meanwhile, Jennie found herself suffocating under the critical gaze of the Duchess of Marlborough at Blenheim Palace. The Duchess's disapproval was relentless, and Jennie's frustration spilled into a letter to her mother. "I quite forget what it is like to be with people who love me. The fact is, I loathe being here. It is gall and wormwood to me to accept everything or argue. I hate it. The Duchess hates me, perhaps because I am a little prettier and more attractive than her daughters. Everything I do or say or wear is found fault with." This was no ordinary domestic discomfort, but a battle of wills between two formidable women, with Jennie trapped in the gilded cage of Blenheim. Her salvation came from her father, Leonard, who purchased a house for the family in London. This move opened a new chapter in Jennie's life, one that would bind her ever more deeply to the political world her husband so ardently pursued. In London, Jennie emerged as the architect of their social strategy. She wrote frequently to her father, pleading for additional funds, assuring him the expenses were necessary for the grand political gatherings she and Randolph hosted, a truth that masked her equal devotion to her dazzling wardrobe. Adorned in exquisite creation, Jennie became the toast of London society. Her sartorial elegance was not mere vanity. It was a calculated effort to elevate her husband's standing. She understood instinctively that her image was as critical to their success as Randolph's rhetoric, and her charm turned every social gathering into a political advantage. Still excluded from the Prince of Wales's elite circle, Jennie redirected her energy into politics, a passion rare for women of her time. She did not settle for the role of a silent observer. Instead, she became a commanding presence, engaging in conversations that bolstered Randolph's stature. Her theatrical flair proved invaluable to her husband, whose nerves often faltered during speeches. At a time when women were expected to merely listen, Jennie's intellect and charisma defied convention, transforming her into one of London's most captivating and influential political hostesses. Politics became Jennie's stage, and she performed with unmatched brilliance. Her connections and influence during these years not only advanced Randolph's career, but laid the groundwork for the future. The relationships she cultivated would later prove invaluable to her son Winston, aiding his rise to prominence. In fostering Randolph's ambitions, Jennie was quietly shaping the destiny of one of Britain's greatest leaders. Their home at Connaught Place became a political hub, a rendezvous for figures of all affiliations. Randolph's burgeoning reputation, paired with Jennie's irresistible charm, drew an eclectic array of individuals into their orbit. Yet, beneath the surface of their social success lay a domestic strain, Randolph's recurrent ill health. From February to October 1882, his condition worsened, leaving him bedridden for 7 months. Jennie took on the role of nurse with unyielding devotion, though Randolph's temperament grew increasingly erratic. His moods shifted unpredictably, oscillating between bursts of frustration and soaring ambition. Through it all, Jennie's steadfast support and gentle persuasion convinced him of his potential for greatness. Jennie accompanied Randolph on his political engagements, acting as both confidant and strategist. She presented flowers at schools, hospitals, and nursing homes, charmed local gossip circles, and sought to sway influential women who could, in turn, influence their husbands. Meanwhile, their home became a marvel of modernity, being the first private residence in London to feature electric lighting. The innovation was such a novelty that visitors flocked to inspect the house, marveling at the cutting-edge technology. In December 1882, Jennie faced a serious illness herself, but after recovering, she made an effort to spend more time with her sons. She took Winston and Jack on walks, shared lessons with Winston, brought him to pantomimes, and even took him on day trips. Despite these moments, Jennie's maternal care has often been criticized, though much of the blame likely rests with the Duchess of Marlborough, who insisted that Winston be raised by a governess and nanny under her watchful supervision, believing Jennie was of a fast set and wanting to minimize her influence on the two boys. Winston, soon sent away to school, fell into the hands of H.W. Sneed Kinnersley, a notorious disciplinarian whose brutal methods left a lasting mark on the boy. Frequently flogged to exhaustion, Winston became deeply depressed, struggling academically and sending home heart-wrenching letters that concealed the full extent of his suffering, but pleaded for a visit. During these years, Jennie's personal life was equally complex. Her affair with Star Falmouth continued, and she frequently spent time with her close friend, Lady Blanche Hosier, the mother of Clementine Churchill. Lady Blanche's scandalous reputation for numerous lovers fed persistent rumors that Clementine's father was not Henry Montague Hosier, but William George Middleton, a notorious rake. Middleton, known for his penchant for clandestine affairs, was also a guest of Jennie's, and whispers of their romantic involvement swirled. Middleton's liaisons extended beyond English high society. He was a close companion of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, famously known as Sisi, and their rumored affair reportedly caused a significant rift between Sisi and her son, Crown Prince Rudolph. For those intrigued by this scandal, be sure to explore our video on Elizabeth of Austria, which delves into this fascinating connection. Meanwhile, Randolph's political star continued to rise. Reflecting on this period, young Winston later wrote, "His hour had come, as his father began to be touted as a potential leader of the Tory party." By 1883, Jennie's life had taken on a frenetic pace, as she became a pivotal force in the creation of the Primrose League, an ambitious initiative aimed at spreading conservative ideals across the nation. Tireless in her efforts, she hosted recitals, orchestrated concerts, and staged elegant garden parties, all designed to draw supporters not only to the League, but to her husband's political aspirations. Jennie's magnetism and flair turned these events into triumphs, her charm enticing even the most reticent attendees into the conservative fold. But behind her polished exterior, Jennie's heart found itself ensnared in the web of a new, intoxicating passion. That same year, she began an affair with Count Charles Kinsky, an Austrian aristocrat renowned for his linguistic prowess, equestrian expertise, and a charisma that could light up any room. Kinsky's refined elegance extended beyond his aristocratic bearing. He was a gifted pianist and an accomplished jockey who quickly became the center of Jennie's emotional world. The affair, scandalous though it was, unfolded under the most delicate veil of discretion, at least initially. Randolph, surprisingly, enjoyed Kinsky's company and seemed to suspect nothing. Kinsky even became godfather to Jennie's sister Leonie's second son, further embedding himself into the fabric of their lives. Winston and Jack, Jennie's young sons, regarded the Count as a surrogate father. Yet, even at his tender age, Winston's perceptiveness betrayed the cracks in Jennie's carefully constructed facade. He later recalled the moment he first suspected his mother's affairs. Observing her stockings as she left the house one morning, he noted a blemish on her left stocking just above the shoe. When she returned hours later, that same imperfection had inexplicably shifted to her right stocking, a subtle but damning detail that Winston's sharp young mind could not ignore. Amid these personal intrigues, the family's fortunes were dealt a devastating blow. In July 1883, Randolph's father, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, died unexpectedly at the age of 61. His passing left Randolph's elder brother George as the 8th Duke, but the majority of the family wealth was tied up in trust for their mother, the Dowager Duchess. The arrangement infuriated George, who, desperate for funds, began selling off the family's treasured art and heirlooms. The ducal title may have passed to George, but the ensuing financial tensions tore the family apart. The bitter public and private quarrels between Randolph and his brother culminated in a complete estrangement. With Leonard Jerome unable to provide further financial support, Jennie and Randolph were left to rely on the generosity of friends to make ends meet. After the death of the 7th Duke, a long-standing feud between Randolph and the Prince of Wales finally began to thaw. The prince agreed to meet Randolph, marking the first steps toward reconciliation, though it would be another 2 years before he dined at their home. When he finally accepted their invitation in 1886, Jennie's magnetism once again proved irresistible. The prince, captivated by her wit and elegance, focused much of his attention on her throughout the evening, a dynamic that did not go unnoticed by London society. Meanwhile, Randolph's burgeoning political career took him increasingly away from Jennie as he traveled the country to solidify his position within the Conservative Party. The strain of his absence did not escape notice, with whispers about their marriage spreading through the corridors of power. Joseph Chamberlain, a political rival, made a barbed remark in Parliament. "I do not know what the domestic habits of the noble lord are, but I confess I'm inclined to augur badly of him if he thinks it a matter of suspicion for a gentleman to stop at home with his family." Amid these challenges, Winston's suffering at St. George's School finally reached a breaking point. Removed from the abusive environment, he was placed in a new school, a move that offered him some respite. Yet Winston's admiration for his father remained undimmed. Randolph's departure on a fact-finding mission to India in 1885, a journey meant to elevate his political standing and reinforce British imperial governance, filled young Winston with pride. Ever enterprising, Winston even asked his father for autographs to sell to his schoolmates, showcasing a budding entrepreneurial spirit. Randolph's return from India was brief. Almost immediately, he departed for France, where he spent 3 months recuperating. When he returned in June 1885, he was appointed Secretary of State for India, a prestigious role that required him to defend his parliamentary seat. However, it was Jennie, not Randolph, who led the campaign. With her characteristic energy and charm, she drove through the boroughs, visiting even the most remote areas to court voters. Though societal norms barred her from making speeches, her presence alone captivated crowds. Her beauty and charisma made headlines, and her efforts paid off, securing Randolph's re-election. When the results were announced, Jennie stood before a jubilant crowd, accepting their cheers as they sang "Rule Britannia," a rare moment of public triumph for a woman whose contributions were often overshadowed by her husband's ambitions. The Tory government's victory soon catapulted Randolph into the role of Chancellor of the Exchequer. The appointment, however, came at a steep cost. The immense pressures of the office exacerbated his already fragile health. Friends remarked that he appeared like a man who had suffered a stroke, his sharp wit and eloquence one day giving way to irrational outbursts the next. The Spectator labeled him politically unstable, while Lord Derby dismissed him as more or less mad. Even Jennie, accustomed to Randolph's mercurial nature, was alarmed. "He looked as if he'd aged a decade in a year," she confided to a friend. In March 1886, the family faced a harrowing crisis when Winston, aged 11, nearly succumbed to pneumonia. Both parents rushed to his bedside, setting aside their differences in a shared moment of anguish. Though Winston recovered, his health remained precarious, compounded by a speech defect that worried both his parents. As Randolph grew colder and more distant, Jennie began to suspect the influence of another woman. At first, she confided her misery to her sisters, and even her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, who advised her to focus on her duties and distance herself from her more scandalous social circle. Yet Jennie felt increasingly abandoned. Rumors began to swirl about an affair between Randolph and Constance Gladys de Grey, Countess de Grey, a celebrated socialite known for her intelligence and charm. Jennie's jealousy and pain were compounded by her inability to confront Randolph directly, as his declining health began to overshadow every aspect of their lives. What Jennie did not yet realize was that Randolph's erratic behavior was not entirely fueled by infidelity, but by a far graver issue, a debilitating illness that would soon alter the course of their lives forever. By December 23, 1886, Randolph Churchill's political career imploded in dramatic fashion. In a bid for greater power and influence, he made the catastrophic decision to resign from the government after losing a crucial vote on a spending bill. The move, intended as a show of strength, backfired spectacularly. Jennie learned of her husband's resignation not from him, but through the morning newspapers. As she confronted Randolph, he greeted her with a sardonic smile, saying, For Jennie, the resignation was nothing short of a betrayal. All she had worked for, all her father's money that had been spent on furthering Randolph's ambitions, and he could not even bother to tell her. The party now viewed him as unstable, and in many respects, this had been his political death warrant. The weeks that followed were bleak. Randolph, sullen and irritable, rarely left the house. He spent his days lying on the couch, chain-smoking, and barely speaking to Jennie. Their once dynamic partnership had devolved into silence and simmering tension. Whispers of divorce began to ripple through society, fueled by rumors of Jennie's affair with Count Charles Kinsky. The press latched onto the scandal, harassing Jennie relentlessly. Even in New York, headlines proclaimed a Churchill divorce as imminent, forcing Randolph to threaten libel suits in a futile attempt to quell the speculation. The scandal placed her in an agonizing position. A divorce, though rare and ruinous in 1886, seemed increasingly inevitable. Yet such a step would come at an unbearable cost. Divorce would mean exile from the very society that had once adored her, along with financial instability, as women in Jennie's position had few legal protections. For context, only 708 divorces had been granted in the UK that year. In a desperate attempt to quell the rumors, Jennie and Randolph made a carefully staged appearance together at the Savoy. The public ovation they received offered a brief reprieve, but it did little to heal the growing chasm between them. She knew maintaining the facade of unity was vital for her children's reputations. She agonized over what would happen to Winston and Jack if the marriage were to come to an end. Ironically, Randolph's resignation had centered on his staunch opposition to increased government spending on armaments, a move he believed the nation could ill afford. History, however, would deal a cruel twist. 13 years later, the very ships Randolph had opposed were instrumental in the Battle of Omdurman, a decisive moment in British imperial history. Among the soldiers at that battle was none other than Winston Churchill, Randolph and Jennie's son, whose courage and charisma would launch him toward the greatness his father had so desperately sought. Jennie was now a fixture in the gossip columns, where every man she encountered was transformed into a rumored lover. Society has invented a new sport for Lady R, one scandal rag sneered. Husband hunting and fiancé fishing, she has earned the title Lady Jane Snatcher. Yet Jennie refused to bow under the weight of such rumors. She immersed herself in the glittering world of concerts, recitals, and her work with the Primrose League, carefully curating her image as an indispensable social force. Beneath the surface, her letters told a different story, one of a woman deeply attuned to Randolph's fragility and fiercely protective of his dwindling reputation. "It is a blessing to think you are well and happy," she wrote tenderly during one of his frequent absences. I trust you utterly and don't care tuppence what people say. By 1887, Jennie's life had grown increasingly complex. The couple's finances, once propped up by her father, Leonard Jerome, were now in tatters. Leonard, who had once been a financial titan, found himself struggling, unable to provide the support his daughters had come to rely on. Seeking solace, Jennie threw herself into the celebrations of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, indulging young Winston's wish to join her for the grand spectacle. Amid the parades and balls, Jennie's friendship with the Prince of Wales, her close confidant, continued to flourish. The prince was utterly captivated by Jennie's wit and charm, and their rumored affair had reportedly begun shortly after Randolph was welcomed back into royal favor. During this jubilant year, Jennie's humor was on full display as she pretended to wear a bustle that played God Save the Queen every time she sat down. The prince, unaware of the servant hidden under her chair with a music box, was reduced to hysterics, a memory he delighted in retelling for years. But the glitter of Jubilee celebrations could not disguise the family's deep financial strain. By 1889, Jennie's time and energy were consumed by her ailing father. Leonard, his health failing, left Manhattan for England, eventually settling in Brighton in the hope that the fresh air might offer some relief. Jennie visited him frequently, watching helplessly as the man she had adored slowly faded. On March 3, 1891, Leonard Jerome passed away, surrounded by his wife and daughters. The man who had once commanded millions was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in New York, leaving behind not only debts, but a devoted widow who spent her final years tirelessly settling them, ensuring no stain on his legacy. Later that year, Randolph embarked on a tour to South Africa, ostensibly to scout opportunities for British emigration, but truly to seek a fortune in gold mining. From afar, Jennie maintained their correspondence, her letters a lifeline of encouragement and carefully measured optimism. You will recover, she wrote, and make a triumphant return to politics, silencing all your critics. Despite their estrangement, Jennie's loyalty to Randolph remained steadfast. By the summer of 1891, Jennie's relationship with Count Kinsky reached its zenith. Kinsky became a near-father figure to her sons, taking Winston to the Crystal Palace and growing so close to Jack that his portrait adorned the boy's room. But their love, doomed by societal constraints, was not to last. Pressured by his family to marry within his class, Kinsky had no choice but to distance himself. Heartbroken but pragmatic, Jennie found solace in the attentions of Lord Frederick Wolverton. Though immensely wealthy and devoted, Wolverton could never evoke the same passion in Jennie as Kinsky had, but his presence offered her a much-needed reprieve. Meanwhile, Randolph's decline became impossible to ignore. His trembling hands, slurred speech, and erratic moods shocked even his closest friends. His letters, once fiery and eloquent, were now filled with confusion. By the way, he wrote Jennie, when is Jack's birthday? And did I send Winston his monthly check? Jennie's heartbreak was palpable, but she bore it with characteristic grace, shielding Randolph from further humiliation while consoling their son Winston, who was finally admitted to Sandhurst. By 1893, Jennie confronted the full truth of Randolph's illness, likely syphilis, though modern historians debate whether a brain tumor may have been to blame. Randolph, his pride shattered and his health deteriorating, clung to the idea of a final adventure. When he proposed a world tour as a last act of defiance, Jennie reluctantly agreed. Together they set sail, embarking on a journey that was meant to span 15 countries. Their luggage included not only the grand attire befitting Jennie's status, but also a lead-lined coffin, a grim acknowledgement of Randolph's precarious condition. It was a desperate bid for adventure and dignity, one final chapter in a marriage defined by ambition, scandal, and resilience. For Jennie, it was another act of loyalty to a man whose legacy would owe as much to her strength as to his own. As Jennie and Randolph embarked on their world tour in the spring of 1894, the cracks in their lives became impossible to ignore. Randolph's health was deteriorating rapidly, his speech slurred, his body numb, and his temper unpredictable. Jennie, under tremendous strain, confided in her sister, "I hate it. I shall return without a friend in the world." The journey became a grim reminder of how far they had drifted. What had once been a partnership of ambition and promise now teetered on the brink of despair, leaving Jennie staring into the abyss of her future. Randolph pressed on, refusing to acknowledge the severity of his condition. Letters home to his mother were filled with optimism, as though sheer force of will could restore him. "I feel better every day," he wrote. "I have every hope of returning to England in June well." Jennie, watching him suffer yet unable to breach his denial, carried the emotional and physical weight of the journey. In Rangoon, her burden deepened. She received a telegram from Count Kinsky, her closest confidant and romantic anchor, announcing his engagement to another woman. His parents, fearful that he might marry Jennie after Randolph's death, had seized the opportunity of her absence to press him into a match. Jennie was devastated, writing to her sister Leonie in desperation, "Do you think it is too late to stop it? Please urge him to delay until I have seen him. If I am given the chance, I will redeem all the past." But her plea was futile. Kinsky, bound by family duty, was lost to her. Shortly after, she learned that Lord Frederick Wolverton, another admirer, had also married. The twin blows left Jennie reeling, her romantic hopes shattered. Yet even in her despair, she remained by Randolph's side, offering care and companionship as he steadily declined. Each day brought more visible signs of his illness, his paralysis worsening, his speech faltering, and yet he continued to insist he was improving. By now, even Winston understood the gravity of his father's condition. The young man, now 20, and showing a budding maturity, wrote letters to Jennie, urging her to remain strong. "You are the strongest woman I know," he reassured her. Jennie, strengthened by Winston's words, began to accept the truth. "Charles deserves a good wife, young and pretty, without a past, who can give him children and make him happy," she wrote of Kinsky. "I wish him every joy." The Churchills limped home by Christmas, returning to live with Randolph's mother at Grosvenor Square. The Dowager Duchess, once so critical of Jennie, softened in admiration of her daughter-in-law's devotion throughout the tour. Yet for Jennie, the weight of grief and exhaustion was unrelenting. Why had things gone so wrong? She wailed to her sister. In January 1895, Randolph's decline became unbearable. He could barely speak, eat, or move, and morphine offered his only relief. The family gathered at his bedside for their farewells. He managed a faint smile for Winston and Jack and spoke haltingly to Jennie, who scarcely left his side despite her own exhaustion and neuralgia. On January 24, 1895, Randolph died quietly at the age of 45. Jennie was dazed, her grief compounded by the enormity of what lay ahead. Her sisters helped with letters and telegrams, as old friends came to pay their respects. The Thames froze over that winter, and snow fell on the day of Randolph's funeral. Among the mourners was the Prince of Wales, who wrote to Jennie afterward, praising her courage and offering his heartfelt sympathies. Randolph left Jennie £500 and the income from his estates to their sons. The capital for Winston and Jack amounted to £75,000, thanks to Randolph's South African investments, but debts of £66,000 to the Rothschild Bank weighed heavily on his legacy. Jennie now faced life on a restricted income, relying partly on rental payments from her father's New York property. In March, seeking solace and renewal, Jennie traveled to Paris. At 41, she met William Burke Cochran, a U.S. congressman and renowned orator, also recovering from personal tragedy. The two formed a tempestuous bond, becoming lovers that year. Jennie found herself invigorated by their fiery relationship. "Burke wears me out," she admitted, while Cochran confessed, "She exhausts me." Their passionate quarrels and reconciliations seemed to breathe new life into Jennie, who returned to England feeling revived. Cochran, deeply impressed by Jennie, expressed interest in meeting Winston, a meeting that would leave a lasting impact on the young man. Yet grief continued to shadow Jennie's life. In April 1895, her mother Clara Jerome fell ill and passed away. Though Jennie had always been closer to her father, the loss of Clara marked the end of an era. Her sisters arranged for Clara's body to be returned to America for burial, next to Leonard and Camille, the child they had lost. Amidst the loss and upheaval, Jennie and Winston grew closer. From this moment onward, Jennie would become Winston's most steadfast supporter, channeling her relentless energy and formidable network to propel him toward greatness. For his part, Winston would grow to become her anchor. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of shared trials, became a source of strength for both mother and son. Together, they formed a bond that transcended the ordinary, rooted in resilience, ambition, and a shared understanding that destiny still had great things in store for them. As Jennie reflected on her life after Randolph's death, she confided to her sister with characteristic candor, "If I had to live my life over, I would still marry Randolph and do everything the same." For all the heartbreak, scandal, and sacrifice, Jennie never wavered in her belief that her choices, flawed though they might have been, had shaped a life of purpose and consequence. Now her focus shifted entirely to her sons, especially Winston, whose future she championed with a zeal that mirrored her own ambitions. In September 1895, Winston departed for South America, marking a pivotal step in his budding military career. Ever the strategist, Jennie paved the way, sending introductions to William Burke Cochrane, the brilliant American orator who had deeply impressed her during her time in Paris. Cochrane welcomed Winston with open arms, hosting him at his Fifth Avenue apartment and engaging him in wide-ranging discussions on economics, liberty, and even yacht racing. Winston, awestruck, wrote to his mother, "He is one of the most interesting and charming people I have ever met," detailing their conversations and the intellectual stimulation Cochrane provided. For Winston, Cochrane became not just a mentor, but a father figure. He taught Winston the art of oratory, how to pace a speech, land a phrase, and inspire an audience. The bond between them was transformative, and Cochrane's influence on Winston's political philosophy would endure for the rest of his life. "I owe you a great deal for all you have done," Winston wrote his mother, "but what I crave most is your applause." Back in England, Jennie was brimming with pride as Winston published his first account of Cuba. But her maternal pride was matched by relentless pragmatism. In July 1896, she lobbied tirelessly for Winston's transfer to South Africa, appealing directly to Field Marshal Lord Wolseley. Winston despised his post in India, believing it would stifle his prospects, and Jennie left no stone unturned in her efforts to fulfill his ambitions. "You have so much power," Winston implored her. "Take no refusal." But Jennie, ever practical, urged her son to excel wherever he was stationed, reminding him that failure was not an option. Jennie's devotion to Winston was not one-sided. Winston, who had once been a petulant schoolboy, now showed a burgeoning sense of responsibility toward his mother. When he and Jack inherited their coming-of-age fortunes, they both chose to halve them to pay off Jennie's debts. For Winston, university was replaced by self-education. Jennie sent him volumes of Aristotle, Gibbon, and Plato to India, where he read voraciously, supplementing his lessons with his father's speeches, which he read over until he knew them by heart. Yet Jennie's life extended far beyond her role as Winston's champion. She continued to dazzle London society, becoming a fixture at events like the Devonshire House Ball, the crowning glory of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. Dressed as Empress Theodora, the courtesan-turned-empress of Byzantium, Jennie's costume, crafted by Worth in Paris, was a masterpiece. Her presence captivated the crowd. Though now in her 40s, Jennie remained one of the most beautiful women in London, her striking features and lively demeanor drawing admiration from all. Behind the glamour, however, Jennie's financial troubles loomed. That same year, she fell victim to a swindler, James Cruikshank, who persuaded her to invest in a fraudulent scheme, costing her £4,000. "My own affairs are in a dreadful state," she confessed to Winston. "How I wish we were together. I am so proud of all your qualities. You are made of stern stuff." Winston, isolated in India and feeling like a bookish outsider, clung to Jennie's letters for comfort. Her words became the highlight of his week, offering him guidance, encouragement, and the maternal warmth he had long craved. Jennie, in turn, acted as his agent and advisor, securing the publication of his articles in British newspapers. When Winston expressed dissatisfaction with the fees offered, Jennie gently chided him. "Don't haggle. This is just the beginning." Jennie's dedication to Winston's career knew no bounds. When he begged her to help him secure a transfer to Egypt, She even traveled there herself to plead his case directly with the field marshal. Though her efforts were unsuccessful, her willingness to go to such lengths underscored the depth of her love and belief in her son. During this time, Jennie's relationship with the Prince of Wales deepened. Their connection blended affection, flirtation, and mutual fascination. The prince teased her in letters about her rumored lovers, writing with a mix of jealousy and humor. "So tell me about your next victim," he joked, referring to her affair with Hugh Warrender. Jennie, ever unconventional, reveled in his attention. She delighted him with her Japanese dress, commissioned during a trip to Kyoto, and her uninhibited charm, a stark contrast to the more restrained women in his circle. By the end of 1897, Jennie's life was a tapestry of contrasts: financial struggles and social triumphs, maternal devotion and romantic intrigue. Jennie, now unattached, became a magnet for gossip. Every man she encountered was rumored to be a suitor, and newspapers speculated wildly about her future. One scandal sheet even reported an engagement to William Waldorf Astor. While Jennie admitted to a brief affair with the reserved millionaire, she declined his proposal, calling him too staid. Winston, meanwhile, returned to England briefly, where his speeches electrified audiences and earned him immediate acclaim as a gifted orator. Jennie, ever his tireless champion, maneuvered relentlessly behind the scenes, securing introductions and lobbying key figures to advance his career. After 2 years of effort, and a minor scandal involving Lord Kitchener's initial refusal, Winston was finally sent to Egypt, joining the 21st Lancers. In Egypt, Winston faced the horrors of war at the Battle of Omdurman, where he experienced his first cavalry charge. "It was the most dangerous 2 minutes I would live to see," he wrote to Jennie, his exhilaration tempered by the grim reality of the aftermath. Deeply disturbed, he condemned the massacre of wounded dervishes as a stain on the victory. Jennie, reading his words, must have felt both pride and sorrow for her son, whose moral compass had begun to shape his destiny. Back in England, Jennie's life was far from quiet. She began a passionate romance with George Cornwallis West, a dashing officer 20 years her junior. Their affair was intoxicating, but fraught with controversy. George, besotted, addressed her as Dear Angel and professed his undying love. "I cannot live without you," he wrote, promising to abandon everything for her. Initially, his family believed Jennie's intelligence and culture would benefit him, but when they realized the extent of the relationship, they were horrified. For them, the idea of their son marrying the infamous Lady Randolph Churchill, already in her 40s and unable to provide an heir, was unthinkable. Even the Prince of Wales intervened, warning George against marrying an older woman. As public gossip about their age difference reached a fever pitch, Jennie, ever pragmatic, recognized the damage their relationship was causing. Heartbroken, she ended the affair, believing it was for George's own good. Seeking purpose beyond the whirl of romance and scandal, Jennie turned to an ambitious new project, the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Review. "I looked at my life," she wrote, "and thought, was all it held endless balls and parties?" She resolved to produce a quarterly magazine of enduring significance. Drawing on her wide circle of influential friends, she secured contributions from luminaries such as Henry James and the Duchess of Devonshire. The first issue, published in June 1899, was praised for its elegance and scope, though critics questioned its lack of focus. Undeterred, Jennie threw herself into the endeavor, determined to leave her mark. That same year, war broke out in South Africa, and Jennie's focus shifted once more. She chaired a committee of prominent American women in London, raising £45,000 to outfit a hospital ship, the Maine. Sailing under the flags of the Union Jack, the Stars and Stripes, and the Red Cross, the ship was a testament to Jennie's determination. She insisted on accompanying the vessel to Cape Town, ostensibly to mediate between American nurses and British officials, though her heart was set on reuniting with her sons and George, all of whom were involved in the conflict. As the Maine prepared to depart, Jennie received devastating news. Winston had been captured by the Boers. For weeks, she agonized, her anxiety palpable. Then, as the ship sailed through heavy fog, word came of Winston's daring escape and triumphant return to British lines. Jennie, relieved and elated, carried on, arriving in Cape Town in January 1900. There, she briefly reunited with Winston and Jack before they returned to the front. However, she received word that George had been wounded and already sent home, causing her to fear for his health. Jennie's time aboard the Maine was not without controversy. Critics accused her of overshadowing the nurses and using the ship as a personal venture. Male colleagues bristled at her authority, dismissing her as imperial in attitude. Jennie, unbothered, dismissed them as weak prigs in private letters. She wrote tirelessly on behalf of the injured, oversaw their care, and documented her experiences for the Anglo-Saxon Review. "I felt gratified to do my small part," she reflected, even as she faced harsh scrutiny. By April 1900, Jennie returned to England. George Cornwallis West met her upon arrival, still defying his family's attempts to marry him off to an heiress. Then, with her characteristic defiance of convention, Jennie married George Cornwallis West in the summer of 1900. At 46, she was unapologetic, embracing the scandal and the gossip with the same daring spirit that had always defined her. Jennie's marriage to George Cornwallis West sparked scandal from the outset. At 46, she wed a man 20 years her junior, a decision that provoked derision from all corners. George's family boycotted the wedding, while the press delighted in branding Jennie a cradle snatcher. Even her closest friends questioned her choice, but Jennie met their scorn with her usual unflinching poise. She was, as ever, a woman determined to live on her own terms. Despite her personal upheavals, Jennie's devotion to Winston remained steadfast. In 1900, breaking off her honeymoon, she joined him on the campaign trail in Oldham, where he stood as the Conservative candidate for Parliament. Her magnetic presence and deft social maneuvering galvanized supporters, and on October 1st, Winston, at just 26, was elected to Parliament. It was a triumph Jennie took as much pride in as if it had been her own. The following year brought the end of an era. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 marked a seismic shift, ushering in the more relaxed and glamorous Edwardian age. For Jennie, this was a new dawn. Her longtime connection to the newly crowned King Edward VII, once a lover and now a loyal friend, elevated her further in society. Edward honored her service during the Boer War, bestowing upon her the Order of the Royal Red Cross and naming her a Lady of Grace of St. John of Jerusalem. These accolades reaffirmed Jennie's status not just as a socialite, but as a woman of substance and action. Winston's career continued to rise, and Jennie remained his fiercest supporter. She organized lecture tours for him in both England and America, drawing on her extensive network to arrange meetings with luminaries like Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, and her dear friend Burke Cochran. As Winston flourished, comparisons to his late father filled the press, a parallel Jennie found deeply satisfying. But while Winston's star ascended, Jennie's marriage to George began to falter. George, initially enchanted by Jennie's vivacity, grew resentful of her unwavering attention to Winston and sought solace in other women. Jennie, though wounded, channeled her energy into her creative pursuits. Her magazine, the Anglo-Saxon Review, ceased publication in 1901 after a dazzling but brief run. Undeterred, Jennie turned to memoir writing, publishing The Reminiscences of Lady Randolph Churchill in 1907. Dedicated to Winston and Jack, the book was a bestseller, praised for its charm but carefully curated to avoid controversy. Jennie's views on women's roles revealed an intriguing contradiction. While she was a woman of immense influence, she was vehemently opposed to the suffragette movement. She dismissed their militant tactics as odious and believed women wielded greater power through charm and diplomacy than through the vote. As president of the North Wales branch of the Anti-Suffrage League, Jennie gave impassioned speeches denouncing women's suffrage, a stance rooted in her patrician outlook. These beliefs, though deeply troubling, were held by many women of her generation. By 1908, both of Jennie's sons married. Jack wed Goonie Birdie, a spirited woman Jennie adored, while Winston fell for Clementine, the daughter of Jennie's old friend Lady Blanche. Though Jennie admired Clementine's intelligence and grace, the two women were never close. Clementine, reserved and serious, found Jennie vain and extravagant, believing her marriage to a much younger man had made her ridiculous. Yet Jennie beamed with pride as both her sons forged lives with strong, capable partners. Jennie's own marriage, however, was crumbling. George's affairs were now an open secret, and the once romantic bond between them had dissolved into resentment. Seeking solace, Jennie turned to playwriting. Her drama, His Borrowed Plumes, premiered in 1909, starring the celebrated actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell, known as Stella. The play, semi-autobiographical in nature, revolved around a writer grappling with her husband's jealousy and infidelity, a plot that eerily mirrored Jennie's life. Though it ran for only 2 weeks, the production drew significant attention, not least because of the affair that blossomed between George and Stella during rehearsals. The humiliation stung, but Jennie bore it with characteristic dignity. In private, she confided to her sisters about her regret over marrying a man so much younger than herself. "Men are all liars from the cradle to the grave. They will never change. I hate them all," she wrote. Letters from her former lover, Count Kinsky, now a prince who had also had an unhappy marriage, reminded Jennie of what might have been. Had Jennie married Kinsky, a friend later remarked, the real loser would have been Winston. Her primary love would have found its outlet elsewhere. Despite the personal turmoil, Jennie remained a force. She continued to host political and literary salons at Salisbury Hall, a home steeped in history and rumored to be haunted by the ghost of Nell Gwynn, the mistress of Charles II. Her 2 sons, the pride of her life, were now both in happy marriages, and she became a grandmother twice over in 1909 as both Jack and Winston became fathers. In May 1910, the death of Edward VII marked the end of an era for Jennie. Though he reigned for only 9 years, his presence had profoundly shaped her adult life. He had been her lover, confidant, and loyal friend, a connection few women in his circle could claim. To Jennie, Edward was a kindred spirit, a man who understood her wit, charm, and enduring ability to captivate. She mourned him deeply, writing to Queen Alexandra, "He was a great king and a lovable man." As the nation grieved, so did Jennie. The London season came to a halt, its dazzling whirl of balls and parties replaced by somber reflection. She paid her respects not only to the Queen but also to Edward's longtime mistress, Alice Keppel, a graceful nod to a shared understanding of his complex affections. Jennie's relationship with George Cornwallis West had by this time unraveled. They lived apart, their once passionate bond eroded by jealousy and the strain of George's financial troubles. Despite her private sorrows, Jennie turned her energy outward, throwing herself into public causes with fervor. She organized a Shakespearean ball to raise funds for a national theater, transforming the Albert Hall into a lush Elizabethan garden. Clad in a sumptuous costume as Olivia from Twelfth Night, Jennie dazzled the crowd, proving she could still command the spotlight. The event was a success, attended by King George V and Queen Mary, now the stewards of a new chapter in British history. At his coronation, she sat in the King's box next to Alice Keppel, which the ever-cruel London society dubbed the King's Loose Box. By 1912, her marriage to George was irreparable. He wrote to her, "If I ever do anything in the world that is worth doing, it will have been because of you." Jennie, ever gracious, replied, "I have loved you devotedly for 12 years, and this love will only die with me." Yet love could not mend what time and circumstance had broken, and in 1913, Jennie filed for divorce. The separation came at a heavy cost. Jennie, already burdened by debts from her lavish lifestyle, now faced financial uncertainty without George's dwindling support. In 1914, he filed for bankruptcy. Owing more than £15,000, the notice in the Times was cut out by Jennie and placed among her papers. However, much darker problems loomed on the horizon, and in 1914, Britain was at war. Her son Winston was now First Lord of the Admiralty, and the war would see his fall, but Jennie, ever resilient, would rise again to even greater heights than before. At 65, she was more than a relic of a gilded age. She was a force. While her contemporaries withdrew, worn down by time, Jennie pressed forward, proving once more that her indomitable spirit could not be confined by convention or circumstance. Her convictions began to shift in the crucible of war. Once an opponent of women's suffrage, she now marveled at the grit and contributions of women across the nation. She campaigned to release male footmen from households, to serve in the military, and proudly watched as women stepped into roles once deemed impossible. "War will advance the role of women in society," she told a New York Times reporter. "The world will remember what women have done here." Jennie herself became a symbol of this transformation. She edited a book celebrating women's war efforts, raised funds for famine relief in Belgium, and persuaded Paris Singer to open his Versailles-inspired mansion as a hospital. As matron of a London hospital, she organized ambulances, entertained troops with piano recitals, and toured barracks to boost morale. Despite her earlier skepticism, she now called for women to be granted the vote, praising their wartime service as a debt no nation could ignore. Her own heart, however, was never far from Winston's plight. For Jennie, the war's most piercing tragedy was Gallipoli. Winston's vision for the campaign, bold and daring, ended in disaster, leading to his ouster from government. He resigned, joined his regiment at the front, and became Major Churchill. Jennie's faith in him never wavered. "You are destined for greater things," she wrote to him, railing at the government's short-sightedness. Her fury mirrored the indignation she had once aimed at Randolph's detractors, but Winston, ever pragmatic, tempered her passion. "Your tone should be salt, not bitter," he counseled. While air raids rocked London, Jennie remained steadfast. She dined out during Zeppelin attacks, refusing to alter her life. "It would be giving in to the enemy," she declared. Her courage and unflagging belief in Winston won her even Clementine's respect, a woman once critical of her. During the darkest days, Jennie's strength became a beacon for her family. Even in wartime, Jennie found space for love. Montague Porch, 23 years her junior, captured her heart with his devotion and youthful vigor. "He has a future, and I have a past," Jennie quipped. Against all odds, they married in June 1918. London society buzzed with amusement and envy at her vitality. Her sons, initially skeptical, gave their blessing. Winston remarked at the wedding, "I know you will never regret marrying her." Montague never did. As the war ended, Jennie continued to embrace life. She learned to fly, soaring over Kent at 90 miles per hour, and even appeared in a small film role. She visited her 6 grandchildren, attended friends, and remained a steadfast supporter of Winston, who had returned to government. In 1920, she moved to a modest home on Charles Street, the very road where her life with Randolph had begun. The circle felt complete, but fate would not let her exit quietly. During a visit to friends, Jennie slipped and fractured her leg. Complications set in, and gangrene necessitated an amputation. Ever defiant, Jennie refused to let the loss dampen her spirit. "I'm putting my best foot forward," she joked, even as she wrote poignant letters reflecting on her life. "My poor departed leg led me on some very grand walks," she mused. "I am not to be pitied." Just when she was thought to be recovering, an artery burst in her leg, leading to profuse bleeding. Her final words were, "Nurse, I am feeling faint," then falling unconscious. On June 29, 1921, Lady Jennie Churchill died. Winston, embroiled in a government crisis, rushed to her side, arriving at the same time as Jack. Later that day, Winston wrote, "She will never know old age, decrepitude, or loneliness. After all the sunshine and storm of life, she looked very beautiful and splendid. Since this morning, 30 years have fallen from her brow." She was laid to rest beside Randolph, in the shadow of Blenheim Palace, where their journey had begun decades before. The great estate, once the stage for her battles with the formidable Duchess, now stood silent as the sun cast its golden light over the quiet country church. Her grave was adorned with white roses and orchids, symbols of the beauty and grace she carried through every chapter of her life. From a carefree girl riding beside her father through the bustling streets of New York to a poised and magnetic force at the heart of British society, Jennie had lived as few dared to live. She had stood behind Randolph and Winston as they delivered speeches that stirred the nation, and she had commanded attention in her own right, a woman unafraid to rise, fall, and rise again. The choir's hymn rose gently over the assembled mourners, their voices a prayer to the heavens. Winston stepped forward, his face etched with grief and resolve, and cast red roses into her grave, a gesture of devotion to the woman who had shaped his destiny. The sexton dropped the earth, sealing a life that had burned bright with ambition, love, and defiance of convention. Condolences poured in from princes, statesmen, and admirers across the globe, Asquith, Lloyd George, and her confidant Burke Cochrane among them. The press hailed her as the mother of 2 remarkable sons, the dazzling beauty who had graced an era of kings and queens. Yet, in 1921, few fully grasped the magnitude of Jennie's legacy. To the world, she was the scandalous wife, the eternal enchantress, the indomitable social force. But to Winston, she was the constant star that had guided him through every storm, the unshakable faith that lifted him when others doubted, the light that never dimmed, even in the darkest moments. 30 years later, Winston Churchill would be hailed as Britain's savior, the indomitable leader who steered the nation to victory in its darkest hour. History would remember his speeches, his courage, and his steadfast resolve. But behind that towering figure was Jennie, the woman who nurtured his brilliance, taught him resilience, and shaped the course of history. Few paused to honor the mother who gave him his light, but Winston knew, as he always had, that she was the force behind his greatness. Thank you for watching this week's video on Sara Delano Roosevelt and Jennie Jerome Churchill. And to all the mothers, fathers, grandparents, guardians, and quiet forces who do the little things, the things that shape a life, even when no one sees them, thank you too. This video is dedicated to my own mother and to my son, Jan. I love you. And thank you, as always, to the mythic men and women who continue to support this channel. Velocity Girl Zen Life 68, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafam Chung, Deborah Himes, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Deborah Shepard, Jules Mack, Kimberly Ray, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Shauna Supreme, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Roxanne Schuster, Kelly Bowen, Melissa Gilmore, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Deb Fisher, Indira Betcha, Sumari Stamps Henderson, Nikayla Ryana, Ida Kloster Jensen, Joanne Thomas Yakato, Laura Lamond, Janet Phelps, Catherine Radensky Harrison, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Meikle Dean Augustine, Karen Craig, Lynn Sharp, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Black Knight 5897, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Deborah Britton Offer, Pitchick, Ram, Fiona McDougall, Amy Johnson, Patricia Ahmad, Elizabeth Moore Ross, Mary Margaret Cronin, The Moon is Blue Tonight, Julia Sierra Sanchez, MPB Angola, Deborah Eaton Kent, Rebecca Christians, Catherine Wolfe, L. Stadler, Albert Norman LeBeouf, Julie Woith, Susan Gillen, Hello Kitty, J.K., Mary Ellen Bashaw, Beverly Mary, Julie Hensley, CBL Unlimited, Cody Griffith, Flora, Washacat, Claire Bletcher, Patricia Hoffman, Nika Loving, Jenny Foster, Nicole Ramsey, Julianne D., Peter Kaukonen, Nida Smith, Nida S., Jacqueline Spalding, Crystal Wilhite, Mina, Cynthia Mace, Ann Casillas, MM, Michelle Gross, Trisha Commons, Lori Weckbaugh, Miriam Danielle, Sally, Tillery Sims, Cynthia Nagley, Shauna Nelson, Jody Bertolucci, Devin Hughes, Tiffany Bristow, Leanne, Jody Mamenga, Tracy Wilson, Ashley Kane, Beth Dawson, Colleen Fay, Joanne Fuller, Catherine Beecher, Kelly K. Peck, Susan, Eliza Richards, Yusra Haroon, Mercedes Boyk, Perry Dawson, Mark Fowler, Kalina Langa, Catherine Groh, Diamond Girl, Maya, Caroline Oakley, Carrie Wallace, Claire Fuller, Luana Lincoln, Susan McBride, Sue Henderson, Brooke Monteith, Ori, Bethany Lee, The Mouse's Ear, Michelle Cohen, Lindsay Stroker, Malik Nindier, R. Denton Sunshine, Wanda Von Kleist, Karen Ursel, Margaret Vona, Susan Cox, River Rose Swan, Mary Brisbane, Laura Cochran, Tiffy B., Lee Scruggs Parker, Jan Lundberg, Sarah Claire Mulligan, Margarita Coyne, Eileen Morris Duke, Brainy Brunette Barbie, Jennifer T., Marie Therese Baker, Annette Stevens, Paul Fleischer, Snowball, Susan Sinaden, Three French Hens, Andrea Blackburn, TJ Sia, Sandra B., Laura Frankstone, Claudia Matelli, Jean, Jen Eric, Anne-Marie Walker, Donay Crossley, Nature Grell, L.M. Zeller, Murphy's Bed, Vicky Russell, Coralie Reed, Charles Rosenbaum, Maria Swisher, Hakuni Cat, Barbara Booth, Sarah Williamson, Katie Girl. Virginia Martinez, C. Mumbles, Phoenix Armigo, Me Here, Moira Ward, Cheryl Ann Rose, Dizzy Gal, Ariana Luna, Rayleigh, Libby Lee, Nancy Jessup, Diana Heritage, Francis Caspano, Kathleen Gallagher, Cy Fupp, C. Ark, E. Harrison, Sandra Irish, The Original Omnivox, Nanny Patty, Miguel Fernandez, Lady Kim, Bruce Spencer, Judy Van Cleef, Marianne McNeil, Very, Trudigen, SD Eaglefeather, Bobby Athena, Ronnie McKinley, Gojar Jock, Peggy Adams, Bruce LeClaire, Candy Cruzin, Naps for All, and Karen Williams. Thank Birdie, Helen Wilson, Rondaya, Leonie Frida, L. Copywriter, Alex Mell, Evelyn Agielko Asor, Carolyn Mulder, Kathleen Kyler, Carol Lee Abrahamson, Vicky Hewlett, Jennifer Trivedi, Greg Sapaniak, Harlow Ryu, Sue Put Conan, KMGG, Sarah Diagardi, T. Nicola, and Terry Lynn. And finally, a word for Boo Boo, a longtime viewer of the channel who is dealing with a health issue at the moment, and for her sister, who is caring for her. Never forget, you are strong, you are brave, and sometimes the hardest battles are the quiet ones, fought in the silences where no one else can see. But you are not alone. And to everyone who stays to the end, thank you for watching Mythic Women.